Chapter 585. Lionel felt as though his grandfather's every word was grating on his soul. But he still stood there, his mind wrapped in a steel cage, clearly unwilling to accept the things he was hearing. A part of him would have rather ignored it all. As quick as Lionel's mind was, if he wanted to come with excuses to ignore valid points, he could run circles even around this grandfather of his. His mind was simply too nimble and quick. And as expected, that was exactly what he did. In no more than a breath of silence, he had already come up with several rebuttals. His father? Wasn't he just restricted by the same things the hidden families were? How could he have interfered if he had rules he wasn't allowed to break? His treasures? If he had handed them in, would they really have helped his friends? Trusting Supreme Monet with his things, would that have really been an intelligent thing to do? Pisces. That backstabbing bitch? Was she really the same as the weak? Why should she be categorized as such? The worst of it all was the fallacy of Emperor Fox's argument. He and Lionel weren't even remotely in the same position. One of them hadn't even known of their noble status until a few weeks ago, while the latter was an emperor of a world. There was a very clear dividing line in their responsibilities. There was no way Lionel should care more about the citizens of Earth than their emperor. Even if Lionel was the most selfish individual there was. So what? His burden wasn't the same as this supposed emperor. Why were they even being compared? However, in the breath it had taken Lionel to think of these things, Emperor Fox had continued speaking as though he had never taken a pause to begin with. Those were the last words he'll say on the topic. If you feel that you would be a better emperor, I am right here. If you can defeat me, the throne is yours. Imperial Father. Lionel's expression finally cracked, replaced by something other than indifference for the first time. This man before him felt like rolling hills that extended to infinity, like an endlessly rising land that shot into the skies, like a lurking beast slumbering as though there was nothing that could gain his interest. Emperor Fox ignored his son. But the weight of this crown isn't something you can carry. You're weak. And worst of all, you don't seem to know that you are. The emperor looked toward Lionel as though he could see through him completely, even down to all the rebuttals he had at the tip of his tongue. But true to his word, he didn't speak a single word about the topic again. It seemed he wasn't lying. He really did disdain to explain himself. If Lionel felt like he could still squirm his way around his words, as though this was a debate rather than real life, that only meant that Lionel was even weaker than even he realized. He had already explained things once. He wouldn't do it again. He had no need for the useless and foolish. The matter of Shield Cross Stars, Emperor Fox continued. You will be safe as long as you are on Earth. My dignity isn't something that can be encroached upon, Shield Cross Stars, or any other. The indifferent declaration seemed to cause the winds to shift. It felt as though the world itself acknowledged the Emperor's words as infallible. Lionel couldn't help but think that it was precisely this old man who had earned the world's spirit before he was born. But he had no way of confirming such a thing. Then again, the thought that he could display such power without the world's spirit was even more shocking. So, shouldn't he just accept this? When you leave Earth, though, you will be on your own. I doubt that Shield Cross Stars will be as blatant as they have been to this point, but with the death of that Commander Scythe, their approach will be more subtle this time. Lionel didn't even know who this Commander Scythe was. But for some reason, hearing his name made him feel as though he was falling further and further into this quagmire that was his grandfather. Those who understood the backstory of this matter would most definitely be shocked beyond belief. Commander Scythe had been biding his time to strike at Lionel, yet he had died. Just like that. As though that wasn't shocking enough, Commander Scythe was a fifth-dimensional existence. The bounty on your head won't be changing, nor will your fugitive status. That said, that only matters to those who know of it. When it comes down to it, you will have to protect yourself. Lionel felt as though his head was spinning. He had a bounty on his head, but only some people knew about it. He had a fugitive status, but it only mattered to those who knew of it. What did any of that mean? Was he a criminal, or wasn't he? Would he be hunted down, or wouldn't he? What was the truth? The crux of the matter was that, as Era had alluded to, the universe was a vast place. Even with Shield Cross Stars acting as the police force of the dimensional verse, even they didn't move as one unit. They were split into countless quadrants which were even further separated into several overarching factions. Commander Scytha's quadrant was on full alert, the very same quadrant terrain and Earth were located in. Logically, as a person who was now a Tier 3 criminal, Lionel was only just shy of the true scum of the universe. Yet, due to Scytha's actions in deploying the decree, Lionel's status had become more like a ticking time bomb than a falling meteor. If anything, maybe Lionel's most immediate threat was Era. Unfortunately, Lionel didn't have enough information about the universe to complete such thorough analysis. Even to this point, he had no idea how powerful Shield Cross Stars was. He could only find time to interrogate the dictionary. But he was so lost in his own thoughts that he didn't even react as he was being escorted out the palace. Even to the end, Emperor Fox really couldn't bother to explain himself in full. The fact he said anything at all was only a testament to the fact Lionel was his grandson. Nothing less, and definitely nothing more. However, as Lionel stood in a daze at the palace gates, his uncle seemingly couldn't continue to bite his tongue. "Try not to die," he said coldly. "And while you're out there, try and think of why in a war of such concentrated force, not a single invalid horde appeared from start to finish." The words were like a bomb going off in Lionel's mind. His head snapped backward, but all he saw was his uncle's back view and two large doors slamming shut. Bang! Chapter 586. Lionel sat within the lab setting of the segmented cube, his mind absent. His only company was little Tolly, but seemingly having seen through its master's mood, the little guy was a lot less joyful. It was quite an odd situation to be in. The war for Earth was likely coming to a close even as he sat here. The nightmare that had haunted Aina had been killed by his own hands, and a bounty that should have been hanging over his head was effectively neutered for the time being. Yet, Lionel couldn't find it within himself to be happy in the slightest. In fact, he felt a nagging insecurity eating away at his heart, refusing to let go and filling his chest with a heavy darkness. Uncertainty. It was dangerous enough for a normal human to allow such an emotion to rule them. To fear the unknown and one's future path more than the idea of not taking a step at all was as good as allowing one's life to come to a grinding halt. In a normal world, the worst that could happen would be living out a life of mediocrity. One would become a normal man, wallowing through life with a woe-is-me attitude that wouldn't fade even with age. Such a person would be a perpetual victim for the rest of their lives, blaming their failures on the actions of others, and never undergoing any sort of introspection about what personal decisions might have led to their current situation. However, in a world like this, in a new world order where killing and death was just the product of another normal day, such apathy was the root of more than just failure. Left alone with his own thoughts, Lionel spun his own counter-arguments in his mind over and over again. At one point, his numerous thoughts split into two streams, attacking one another from opposite sides as though determined to completely destroy the other side. The more Lionel thought, the more he realized just how flawed his previous thoughts were. His father was restricted the same way the hidden families were restricted? Was that really true? The hidden families were in a completely separate space, while his own father could appear on Earth itself. Were they really restricted by the same rules? Was that possible? How convenient was it for him to rely on a set of rules he wasn't even aware of to absolve his father of any guilt? It was laughable at best. At worst, he was a terrible kind of hypocrite, the kind of bastard that would shame one for killing then turn a blind eye when a friend committed the same atrocity. And what about his treasure? Even if he didn't give it to Monet, what was stopping him from giving it to someone else? If he had handed it over to Hutch, an old man he somewhat trusted, what kind of result would there have been? If Hutch had the dictionary, how much easier would his battle against the three heads have been? Would he have been struck down to the point he was in a coma? And if his battle against them was easier, wouldn't that mean that he would be able to end it earlier and save more lives? According to what he saw from Rainred's memories, it was precisely because Hutch had been occupied that he became bold enough to travel into the depths of the army and eventually kill Roaring Black Lion and the others. If he had been less selfish, would they have died? The most complicated of Lionel's thoughts revolved around Pisces, this girl he hated with all his heart. But, if he broke it down to the foundation of why it was he disliked her so much, Wasn't it purely because he couldn't stand the fact she survived while those he called friend could only be buried? What was Pisces' worst crime? If Lionel was being objective about it, the worst thing she had done was point Reynard toward Royal Blue Province. This action could have led to a catastrophic outcome had Lionel not dealt with the puppet master. Yet, even then, Reynard hadn't been targeting Royal Blue Province at all when he ran away from Elerin. The province just happened to be the closest piece of land. Regardless of whether he found out this information from Pisces, he would have found out eventually anyway. Just like he had asked for Lionel from those of the Slayer Legion. Asking the same question to those of Royal Blue Fort would have had the same impact. However, if Lionel was the most honest with himself, what infuriated him the most about what she did was the most benign action. She had tried to get his treasures taken away. If he broke down that action, sure, it was rooted in a certain selfishness on her part. But wasn't his rejection of Monet's request also rooted in selfishness? He had no obligation to hand over his things, this much was true. But if he accepted this premise, what right did he have to dislike his grandfather's actions? Of course, to Lionel, this was about more than just the fact the treasures had value. Tied to these treasures was also the fact his father had entrusted him with them. They could be considered to be the last bit of his parents that he had with him. If he took it one step further, these treasures represented his chance at reuniting with his family. It represented a path toward the strength he would need to save Aina. These all sounded like noble matters. But what was more demanding? For him to hand over a treasure that would allow him to accomplish his own selfish goal? Or for the strong to risk their lives to protect the weak? If he felt that it was wrong for the Slayer Legion to take away the last piece of his father that he had and cut off his path toward saving Aina, then how could he also not feel it to be wrong for him to expect others to lay their lives on the line for strangers? These thoughts ultimately led to the final nail in Lionel's coffin. The reasoning he had clung to was that his obligations weren't the same as his grandfather's. One of them was a newly minted prince while the other was the emperor of a world. How could they be equated? Lionel had no obligation to be selfless, but wasn't this the role of a ruler? However, the words of his uncle rang in his mind again and again. No invalid hordes. Not even a single sighting. If an invalid horde interfered in the war, Earth would have been finished. When comparing the talented versus the untalented, which would the invalids prefer to target? The people of Earth would end up being attacked from two fronts, completely unable to counter. Even Lionel wouldn't be able to do anything to change this. What right did he have to question Emperor Fox? Chapter 587. Lionel didn't have any answers. He lost himself in endless tinkering, working his way toward the completion of his divine armor. The space-rending abilities of the terrain cities had given him exactly the enlightenment he needed to comprehend the core intricacies he needed to complete his first armor. But, whereas this matter would have given him great satisfaction in the past, knowing that he had come a step closer to bettering his father in force crafting, currently, he completed every step with an almost eerie monotony. Surprisingly, though this very monotony, the disconnection of his emotions, made his every action even more perfect than they would be usually. He completed everything with a level of precision that existed beyond the realm of humans. Aina entered the lab setting with a hint of worry on her face. Lionel never restricted her movements, so she could enter any location of the segmented cube just as easily as him. Looking at Lionel's back, she wasn't really sure of how to comfort him. The only thing that Aina was sure of was that she didn't want Lionel to change. She didn't want him to become as cold-blooded as the rest of this world. She had said as much when the two were in the Joan Zone together. In fact, that moment between them back then was maybe the most honest she had been with him up to that point. However, now Lionel was stuck in a dilemma he didn't know how to bring himself out of. And it was exactly this sort of matter that Coach Owen had been so worried about. A person without purpose was easily swayed by others. If Lionel had a one-minded pursuit, a dream that was rooted in himself and no one else, how could the words of others so easily sway him? In fact, knowing Lionel, having such an aspiration would make him an untamable monster, an existence the likes of which existed above all others. But at this moment, Lionel still didn't know exactly what that was. And as though this wasn't bad enough, he wasn't even looking for it. As the saying went, one didn't know what they didn't know. It was impossible for Lionel to see through his shortcomings if he wasn't even sure of what they were. But ironically, if he was told of what he needed to look for, it just might have the opposite effect. Something like searching for the purpose of one's life was a monumental task. There were many people in existence that would never find this purpose for themselves. And at this moment, it was unknown whether or not Lionel would be among these individuals. The little mink hopped into Anna's arms, making small, worried purring noises. But even with the slight commotion, Lionel didn't turn back. He was so engrossed that he probably didn't even notice that Anna had entered to begin with. Anna sighed, not sure of what to do. Her gaze drifted from Lionel's back to the numerous snow globes on the wall. Even now there were still hundreds. Some were filled with beast carcasses while the others were filled with various herbs. Though Anna didn't recognize much of the herbs, after her ability had evolved with Earth's metamorphosis, she found that she could somewhat read the life signatures of living beings she came across. Anna wondered if this had to do with the life affinity those trial overseers of Valiant Heart Mountain mentioned. But she wasn't sure. Though she had heard of a blood affinity before, she had never heard of a life elemental affinity. Yet she had both. Regardless, this ability to read life signatures allowed her to extend her ability. Now, not only did she know the perfect way to train her body to break its limits, she also knew what to consume to help break these limits as well. The extension of this ability also gave her an instinct on how to combine and mix certain materials to benefit herself. Such a breakthrough made Anna realize that if she wanted to maximize this new ability of hers, she would have to spend some time reading many beast and herb compendiums. In the past, the only reading Anna had done was for school. Outside of that, she didn't waste even a moment of time on anything other than training. In fact, although she had wanted to go and watch Lionel's games, she never had because she felt time was simply too precious. But now this studying would benefit her future, so she no longer had a choice. Lionel said that he never had much of an appetite when he was younger. Anna bit her lip out of habit as she scanned through the snow globes. Lionel never really put two and two together, but the nutrients packed into his father's vomit brew were so numerous that it would have been impossible for him to have any appetite. If anything, he had been overeating his whole life. I wonder how many delicacies he's missed out on. Anna was the opposite. She had always loved food and often ate a lot of it. Lionel had kicked himself for not realizing she needed more food. But the truth was that wasn't his fault. Anna had purposely suppressed her own appetite in the Joan zone subconsciously, maybe because she was worried about how Lionel would react. However now, if she didn't have enough to eat, Lionel would practically stare her down until she did. With his senses, it was difficult for her to fake being full anymore. The memories, albeit from a short time they had been together, brought a smile to Anna's face. She looked back toward Lionel's back, but he had still not reacted to her entrance. After a hint of hesitation, she looked to the snow globes once again, seemingly having come to a decision. I've never cooked before, but Anna's meals had been handled by Yuri for as long as she could remember. She had zero experience cooking, which was also why she always let Lionel handle it. Though Lionel's cooking lacked flair, and could only be described as mediocre, it wasn't terrible, so the effort always brought a smile to her face. Anna reached out and began picking out ingredients from the shelf of snow globes, her mind spinning as it came up with several ideas. Though her mind was filled with such thoughts, her heart was focused on something else entirely. All she wanted was to share her love of food with the man she liked. Chapter 588. Lionel's hands were as steady as a rock, his gaze measured and sharp. He seemed to be able to see through everything with a glance, the faint image of a snowy owl hovering to his back. Even after more than a day, Lionel didn't seem to realize the special state he had entered. It was as though he had completely forgotten about the world, as though everything else had been destroyed and all that was left was a man, his metal spirit and his craft. Auspicious air hung around Lionel, its density increasing with every moment. Shockingly enough, Lionel had yet to bother to waste any time on healing himself. His body was just as injured as it had been before his meeting with his grandfather. But at the same time, it made the process all the more awe-inspiring. Forgetting the world was one matter, but this had reached the level of even forgetting oneself. To be able to move and act as though anyone else in his situation wouldn't be at the brink of death was baffling indeed. However, the truth of the matter was presented for all to see. It had reached a point where even Aina herself simply assumed that Lionel had been healed. After all, there was nothing about his actions that seemed to point toward injury in the slightest. The auspicious air became heavier and heavier, growing to a point a dense, dirty gold hung in the air. It had much of the color of a mustard yellow with a tinge of a noble gold that betrayed its distinctiveness. At an unknown time, the air grew so heavy that cracks began appearing along the lab setting floors. But what was maybe most shocking was a certain unmoving snow globe began to show signs of being awakened. Unfortunately, Lionel had yet to realize that the acceleration of Earth's evolution toward the fourth dimension wasn't the only reward for perfectly completing Camelot's trials. With a blank expression, Lionel picked up an intricately carved forearm brace. Little Tolly peeled away from the structure, revealing it in all its glory. It shimmered with a beautiful black-silver color. It was formed in several layers, giving it a sharp appearance. Its presence alone seemed to make space warp and quake. However, despite its beauty, Lionel didn't react much to its appearance at all. He absent-mindedly pressed it into his right forearm. As though by magic, Lionel's body flashed with bronze runes and the bracer sunk into his skin, vanishing as though it was never there. Lionel reached toward his work table again. But before he could grab anything, he found that there was nothing left to do. His blank expression slowly recovered, a hint of fatigue hiding behind his pupils. At that moment, a wall of thoughts Lionel had done his best to ignore these last few days began to resurface once again. Lionel grasped at his forehead, a light headache taking hold. A deep sigh left his lips. As much as he wanted to lose himself in a world of crafting again, he had used up all his materials. Unless he raided Camelot's vaults again, there wouldn't be anything left to do. And even if he was that shameless, well, let's just say that King Arthur would probably rip his own hair out if he saw the state of his precious treasure vaults. Lionel didn't quite know how he ended up using so many materials. His original plan didn't require so much. He had wanted to use the others for future crafts he had in mind. When he dug into his memories of what had happened, he couldn't help but raise an eyebrow. His previous best craft was only formed of less than a dozen parts. But this armor was formed of 97. He had thought that he would have to muddle through it for a few weeks, but he had never thought of finishing it all in less than 2 days. Still, rather than feeling proud, he really just wanted something else to throw himself into. Lionel was in a classic state of running away from his problems. Was this what normal teens called procrastinating? It felt worse than just that, though. Lionel had never been one to procrastinate, mostly because he was always good at setting his mind to something and doing it. If not for this, he likely wouldn't have forgotten himself in crafting so easily. My current spear wouldn't pair well with my divine armor. It might be time to change it. If others heard Lionel's thoughts, they would think that he was an ungrateful second-generation nouveau riche. One had to understand the value of a quasi-bronze treasure. Lionel seemed to go through them as though he was drinking water, but such a treasure was the pinnacle of the fourth dimension. Even in the highest fifth-dimensional worlds, a youth like Lionel would scratch and claw for the right to wield such a weapon. Yet, Lionel thought of casually changing his because it simply didn't suit him. Lionel still didn't have a full grasp of the dimensional verse, though, so his face portrayed a very punchable shade of innocence even as he spoke such shameless words. Even if Lionel had known, though, it wouldn't stop him. He immediately sent his mind into spear domain. Not even a quarter hour later, Lionel came out with a new spear. He only tried to stand with it, yet it nearly sent him crashing down to the ground. Oof. I thought 50 pounds was heavy, but this one is over 5,000. This spear was clearly crafted to be heavy. Its body was over 2.5 meters long, and its spearhead was a 3-dimensional monstrosity of over 3 feet long alone. Though there was some taper to the spearhead to give it the semblance of a blade, it still had a width of over half Lionel's palm. No matter how Lionel looked at it, though it seemed to be a spear, it would be better used as a blunt weapon. With some work, it would definitely be a good hammer. Lionel shook his head. This one is no good too. Lionel entered spear domain again, ignorant to the fact he was becoming a menace to society. Chapter 589. The practically blunt spear had a domain similar to Lionel's chain domain. But rather than using chains, it caused fluctuations in weight. Depending on how it was used, it could actually be quite useful. But ultimately, it was just another movement restraining domain that focused on the physical. However, as Lionel began to travel through the spear peaks, he came to realize that this focus on physical restrictions was a running theme amongst the quasi-bronze spears. The next spear Lionel picked up had two heads. He stood immersed in the feeling of its domain, grasping it much quicker than he had with his chain domain. In fact, it almost came with too much ease. Lionel had a feeling that this was because of the completion of his spear embryo into true spear force thanks to his comprehension of the complete Four Seasons realm. But he didn't spend much time thinking about it. This domain, as expected, was another restraining domain. But this one focused on the wind element. The style of this spear peak and many of the spears that formed its base was swiftness. Controlling the flow of wind in battle could allow one to do a countless number of things. But what Lionel saw as the most potent use would be in controlling momentum, snatching the tailwind of an opponent and adding it to your own. Under a protracted battle, someone with this domain would be near invincible. The lethality of such a weapon on a battlefield would be undeniable. Still, Lionel felt that this spear wouldn't meld well with his divine armor either. Not to mention the fact he didn't have a wind elemental affinity. This sort of restraining type of battle style wasn't resonating with him at the moment. Somewhere deep inside, he wanted something more destructive, something he could truly release with. However, every spear Lionel came across seemed to tell the same story. A gravity domain, a water domain, a vine domain. Lionel walked through the spear domain as though it was his own backyard. He had completely forgotten that even taking a single step in this world used to deplete him down to his very core. Now he traveled from peak to peak, not finding anything he could use. By now, Lionel had conquered over a dozen quasi-bronze peaks, but he hadn't found anything he wanted. The truth was that the number of such treasures in spear domain was practically endless. Even after hours of walking, even to the point of ignoring all the foundational spears, Lionel still hadn't come anywhere near the end of them. Lionel believed that there were easily tens of thousands of quasi-bronze peaks. Let alone quasi-bronze peaks, there were probably just as many quasi-silver peak and beyond as well. This treasure seemed to treat such spears as though they were a dime a dozen. And in fact they were, at least here, anyway. It was no wonder Lionel took them for granted. Quasi-silver. Lionel looked up toward the distance. He had grasped a quasi-bronze spear before his soul force was even in the third dimension. Now that he was at the peak of the fourth dimension with his soul force, why not try for a fifth-dimensional weapon? Lionel stepped forward, crossing through the rolling hills with slow steps. The graveyard of spears around him seemed to get particularly silent at this moment. Maybe even the creator of spear domain couldn't have imagined a day where someone within the third dimension would have the gall to stroll through their world in such a way. However, compared to the past, it couldn't be said that Lionel was still unqualified. One had to remember that strength of mind was only one aspect of traveling through spear domain. The most important factor was most definitely one's comprehension of the spear. The first time Lionel had come here, he had barely formed spear force. The fact he could take a single step at all was a testament to how strong his mind was. But now Lionel had fully grasped the four-season realm. Though this wasn't perfectly tailored to the spear, it could be said that the spear, and every other weapon, was perfectly tailored to it. The combination of this comprehension and Lionel's strong mind made the journey forward surprisingly easy. Even when it began to grow difficult, a sharp spear force appeared around Lionel, slicing through the presence of the spears around him. The clashing of blades sung in the air, but Lionel's steps didn't pause. By now, the spears around him had completely morphed. From wooden and half-broken, they began to sing with their own sort of majesty. In fact, they quickly rose from the lower black levels, jumping to Tier 5, through Tier 6 and past Tier 7. By the time Lionel got to the range of the quasi-silver peaks, there were nothing but bronze-grade spears around, each radiating a palpable aura even beyond that of his chain spear. This is the true fifth dimension. Lionel thought about where he had sensed this before, only for his mind to flash to thoughts of a massive flying ship ripping through the barrier of Earth's fold of reality. So that's where. He was in the fifth dimension, but suppressed. Lionel shook his head, still not wanting to think of such things. He basked in the aura of these spears, still not realizing the kind of treasure trove that was before him. As far as Lionel was concerned, after completing his divine armor, he now had the skills to begin crafting bronze treasures. All he needed was the material to do so. However, even for him, a quasi-silver treasure was leagues away. He neither had the strength necessary to claim one from a zone, nor the skill necessary to craft one. In Lionel's eye, all he could see was a single silver light, standing tall atop a spear peak. But unlike the rolling hills of the quasi-bronze peaks, this one looked like a small mountain, stretching over 100 meters tall. Lionel's gaze glowed. He had finally found something else he could throw himself into. Chapter 590. Lionel appeared in the lab setting, his chest heaving. He sent a gaze toward the silver spear in his hand, shaking his head at how crazy he was. He felt like he could have really died climbing that mountain. The presence of this spear made him feel suffocated, let alone the fact its polearm alone was over 3 meters long. It could only be described as a monstrous weapon. Even now, it was shining too brightly for Lionel to get a good look at it. Lionel squinted, but all he could barely make out was the fact this spear was also double-sided, similar to the wind domain quasi-bronze spear he had run into previously. In addition, this spear seemed to be able to split into 3 portions connected by chains. Of course, Lionel couldn't see any of this very clearly. He had only gotten a faint vision of the spear when he first touched it. Outside of that, he had nothing else to pull from. Lionel could feel that the spear was struggling against his grasp as though it had a mind of its own. Clearly, it felt like Lionel wasn't worthy of it. In truth, Lionel couldn't blame it. The normal way to use spear domain would be to slowly master the spears that surrounded the base of the spear peak. The comprehension of these spears would give one the insight necessary to comprehend the domain of the spear at the peak. Only then would one then gain the acknowledgement of the spear in question. But Lionel had bulldozed his way to the top, relying on a combination of his mental strength and his Four Seasons realm. He really had no business wielding such a spear. Beyond this, there seemed to be a qualitative change in weapons after the bronze grade as well. While Lionel's fourth-dimensional weapons were only good for their quality and sharpness, effectively, this spear seemed to be able to affect change in the surroundings. Some of the force arts that formed its foundation seemed to flash into existence from time to time, making their displeasure known. "Shut up," Lionel said faintly, cursing the spear as he fell into a deep sleep. "You idiot. Sleeping on the floor. What were you thinking?" Lionel could vaguely sense his body being hauled out of the lab setting. Before he knew it, he was being thrown into a pool of water. He shot up in confusion, his fatigue vanishing into a feeling of surprise. However, by the time he had shot to the top of the pool, the culprit had already vanished. Lionel wiped his face, sliding his hair back from his eyes. In the end, he chuckled and shook his head. How long had he slept? A few days probably? It was no wonder Aina just tossed him into the water like this. Spear? Lionel blinked, looking around him to find that his spear was nowhere to be seen. He sent his sight into spear domain, only to find the spear back on the spear peak. Lionel shook his head, but he didn't mind too much. Whenever he entered spear domain, he would reappear where he had been last. So at the very least, he didn't need to climb that mountain again. He could just snatch the spear whenever he wanted. If it's double-sided, could it still be called a spear? Lionel shook his head. It didn't matter much. During his time in spear domain, he had seen many weapons that he'd have a hard time classifying as a spear. But he found no real point in thinking about it too much. After he cleaned himself, Lionel walked out of the bathhouse to suddenly catch a whiff of something. His tongue involuntarily watered, his steps quickening. He had hardly been to the place he was headed in. Though he knew the abode setting had everything a normal house would, the kitchen simply wasn't a place he frequented. But this was the first time Lionel could remember smelling food that made him feel as though he was floating on air. Of course, Lionel had smelt good food before. It was just that he never had the appetite to match, so it never really hit him like it did now. And, even after his appetite had returned in full force, well, 90% of Earth was nothing but collapsed buildings and vast ocean now. So, where would he have a chance to smell such delicacies? Lionel rounded a corner and appeared within a luxurious kitchen. If a chef could see this place, they would definitely curse Lionel for wasting such treasures. But it truly wasn't his fault. Much of the things in this place, Lionel had no idea how to use. It was all a mixture of extremely high-tech and ancient cooking devices that left his head spinning. On one corner of the room, there was an oven that looked more like a planetary destruction weapon, but on the other side, there was a stone oven that looked like a place one might have cooked pizza with 500 years ago. Of course, what Lionel didn't know was that with every upgrade of the segmented cube, not only did the cleansing waters improve, but so did the gardens and the kitchen as well. The devices in this place could burn even a beast on the verge of entering the fifth dimension to a crisp. In fact, with some creativity and patience, it could even cook true fifth-dimensional beings as well. This might not sound like a big deal, but if one thought of the dimensions properly, it was like giving mortals the power to cook gods. It was insane that Lionel hadn't seen this place's value before. Of course, in the middle of this large kitchen, there was a petite young lady wearing her hair up in a bun. Beads of sweat fell down her face as she bit her lip, her expression the picture of absolute focus. Lionel seemed to get lost in her efforts. As hard as he had worked to forget things these past few days, just this seemed enough to make him ignore the rest of the world even if it was collapsing around him. Seemingly sensing something, Aina turned toward Lionel with a bright smile on her face as she wiped her brow. The high temperatures of the stove she was working over causing wisps of water vapor to rise from her skin. Lionel's heart skipped a beat. Chapter 591. Lionel should have been taking in what the rest of the room had to offer, but truthfully, he couldn't take his eyes off of Aina. Everything from the beads of sweat falling down her face to the apron clinging to her curves made his heart stop. Aina's smile faded into one of confusion. What's wrong? For a moment, Aina became worried. In truth, she had taken Lionel's things without asking and even started using the kitchen wares and appliances too. Though Lionel had said to treat this place like her home, had she maybe gotten a little too comfortable? She blushed in embarrassment, trying to figure out how she should apologize. Though Lionel never spoke about his parents, Aina had gained a few tidbits here and there, definitely enough to know that this place was left behind by his father. After all, she had been there when Lionel first got the segmented cube. For all she knew, this place was very important to Lionel, but now whatever sentimental value it might have had was washed away by her cooking. But before she could form the words of apology, she found a large shadow enveloping her. Lionel hugged Aina tightly, seemingly not feeling much from the heat around them at all. At his current level, it might as well have been a slight breeze tickling his skin and nothing more. Aina was stunned for a moment. But when she realized what was happening, she panicked. You're going to burn yourself. Lionel pulled back and grinned, his smile beaming. Clearly, though, he didn't take Aina's warning very seriously. In truth, even Lionel didn't quite know why he was so excited. There was just something about the current situation that felt right. Of course, if he said this aloud, Aina would probably beat him to death. He might as well have put his foot in his mouth saying that she belonged in the kitchen. Still, even though he chose to keep these words to himself, he still beamed beside himself, unable to stop himself from feeling happy for the first time in several days. Lionel looked around, only to find a large steel table filled with delicacies. Each had a small cut in them, making it obvious that someone diligent had gone through and tasted each and every one. You did all this? Lionel asked. Seeing that Lionel wasn't mad at her, Aina's smile returned. But before she could answer, a hint of panic colored her features. She had almost forgotten something important. Aina ignored Lionel's question, dashing to the stove and flipping a pan. What looked like an elaborate omelet, expelling a rich fragrance, flipped in the air to reveal a golden brown base that seemed crisp just to sight alone. Aina breathed a sigh of relief before rushing out of the kitchen, pan in hand. Lionel blinked in confusion before hurrying after her. But what he found at the end of her run was something that left him even more stunned than the kitchen had. Unlike the kitchen, Lionel had been here several times. In fact, he frequented this place. However, he had never seen it look like this. The dining room of the abode setting was large enough to comfortably feed a family of 8. But at the moment, every stretch of table was completely covered with a plate or plates of food. Aina stood on her tippy toes, carefully sliding the omelette onto a layered dish as though crowning her final achievement. Aina wiped her brow with a forearm again before smiling lightly. It was only at that moment that Lionel understood that all the dishes that took up the steel table were nothing but experiments. Lionel's heart couldn't help but warm. He had no idea how much effort Aina had put into trying different combinations of beast meat and herbs to eventually come up with all of this, but he was quite frankly left stunned. "What are you just standing there for?" Aina looked toward Lionel. And so Lionel did. He hardly remembered the first bite, but he most definitely lamented the last. He had thought that maybe like those comedic animes his dad always made him watch, he'd have to pretend to love Aina's food to make her feel better. But the reality was completely outside his expectations. Not only did the food look and smell good, it was so delicious that Lionel felt as though he was ascending to another realm. And in fact, in a way he was. It was even to the point where even the injuries he hadn't bothered to heal to this point as though a badge to remind him of something, had begun to heal on their own. Aina watched on with a smile on her face, her elbows on the table and her hands cupping her face. Though she too had a great appetite, after all the taste tests she had done over the last few days, she was as full as could be at the moment. If Lionel knew this, he would probably be even more stunned. With all the tiny bites he had seen before, just how many test dishes would she have to have made in order to be full? However, Lionel was so engrossed in eating that he didn't even realize that Aina didn't have anything for herself. It was only after he had his last bite that he looked up at her, as though he was looking at a monster. Lionel's gaze locked onto Aina, seemingly not wanting to waste time looking at anything else. Aina blinked. "I'm not part of the feast, you know." Lionel was stunned out of his shock into a fit of laughter when he heard these words. "And why not?" He grinned slyly. Aina shook her head and mumbled under her breath. "Men. Maybe Savon was right, you lot can never be satisfied." Lionel coughed and held his chest. Another fatal blow. Aina giggled, seemingly pleased by Lionel's reaction. But after a while, her expression grew to one of worry, scanning Lionel. "Are you all right?" Chapter 592. Lionel sighed hearing Aina's question. Quite frankly, he didn't know how to respond. Was he all right? Well, technically, there wasn't anything wrong with him. His life wasn't in danger, his future wasn't exactly bleak. Truthfully, he didn't have very much to worry about at all. Of course, if the members of Shield Cross Stars heard these thoughts of his, it would be hard to tell how they would react. After all, no one had ever had such a nonchalant response to being designated a Tier 3 criminal. To put matters into perspective, to even be labeled a Tier 9 criminal was enough to have bounty hunters breathing down your neck. To leap from a Tier 4 criminal to a Tier 3 was the equivalent of being a felon that could be sentenced to consecutive life sentences. Lionel was quite literally only short of individuals known for destroying worlds, solar systems and galaxies. This was how serious this matter was. Yet, Lionel hardly spared a thought toward this matter. In fact, ever since his conversation with his grandfather, it was all that had been on his mind. He couldn't find a reason to care about anything else. If it wasn't for the fact that Lionel had already sworn to himself to find a cure for Aina, he might have had no other purpose but to lounge around in depression at the moment. Maybe the harshest truth of it all was that Lionel didn't feel that this matter was even as serious as that. Depression was often something a person couldn't control, an imbalance in the chemicals of the mind that caused up and down swings in mood. Lionel couldn't say he was going through such a thing, but what he did know was that he felt everything that had once been in his control was slowly but surely slipping away. Lionel sighed again. "I just don't feel like I have as much of a grasp on things as I once did. I find it laughable that I thought I understood anything to begin with." Aina gazed toward Lionel, unsure of how she should answer. She didn't feel as strongly about certain things as Lionel did. The deaths of the common folk of Earth? She didn't spare them a thought. There were some things about this cruel world that she was just numb to. If it wasn't for the fact it was someone she cared about feeling this way, even to this point she might not have spared a thought toward those matters. However, at the same time, she didn't want Lionel to keep running from his own thoughts. She was herself while he was him. They would never be the same. While she found it easy to ignore such things, Lionel wasn't the same. That said, Aina felt that there was something off about how much Lionel cared. Almost as though he was trying to cling to ideals that weren't his own while he ran from an even larger problem. Unfortunately, maybe the one things Lionel had never told Aina was about his conversation with Coach Owen and the truth surrounding his birth. Whether by coincidence and subconsciously, or on purpose and consciously, she didn't have the final piece of the puzzle that she needed. Did you always know how to cook this well? Lionel shook his head, quickly changing the subject. Aina realized what he was doing, but there were some things that couldn't be pressed. If Lionel didn't want to talk about it, forcing him to do so would only make him shut down. No, Aina replied with a smile. Usually it was Yuri who always took care of the cooking. I was bored, so I thought I would try my hand at it. Aina waved off her efforts with a hand, but Lionel's silent smile seemed to see right through her. I think it's more than just that, Lionel said after Aina began squirming in her seat beneath his gaze. There was something special about your cooking, as though it had its own unique flow of energy. It was definitely beyond anything I've ever eaten before. Aina couldn't help but smile at such praise. Just that sentence alone seemed to make all her efforts worthwhile. I'm not sure. I only relied on my ability to tell me what combinations would work well. In the end, this was the product. Your ability evolved? Aina nodded. Beyond self-healing and my training intuition, I can tell what resources I need to consume to improve myself. Lionel's gaze glowed. Even without knowing much about the dimensional verse, Lionel felt that this ability would most definitely be exceptionally rare. If just a few days of experimentation allowed Aina's cooking to have such effects, what if she put in more effort than that? Have you ever thought about becoming a force pill refiner? Lionel suddenly asked. Force pill refiner. Aina was stunned. They were called a lot of things. Force pill refiners, alchemists, potionsmiths, elixir crafters. In truth, their products didn't always come in the form of pills. Sometimes it was elixirs and potions, sometimes it was ointments and topical creams, and yet other times it could come in the form of brews or food. Though they came in many different variations, their core principles were similar enough to be lumped into a single group. But, much like languages across worlds, they often had different methods of communication to accomplish the same goals. This was why Lionel was so certain that if Aina could do this, translating her ability to create pills, elixirs, or ointments wouldn't be too large of a leap. Even if she only wanted to focus on food, it wouldn't be a major loss, albeit a waste of her talent. Aina smiled. You know about such things? Lionel almost blushed if it wasn't for the fact his skin was so thick. Aina wasn't wrong. Usually, it was her teaching him about things like this. He was about as ignorant as it came when it was in regards to matters of the dimensional verse. It could be said that the only reason Lionel knew about this profession at all was due to the introductory crafting lessons his father had given him. But you're right, Aina continued after teasing Lionel. I think that learning more systematically rather than relying on my talent will help me improve faster. In Aina's mind, all that mattered was if she could grow stronger. Becoming a force pill crafter was definitely one such method. It would definitely help her self-training reach a completely new level. Just as Lionel was about to respond, his ring began to vibrate. Ah, Valiant Heart Mountain. So soon. Chapter 593. Lionel and Aina's gaze met, both clearly able to see the other's surprise. However, after a moment, they found it easier to accept. When Lionel spoke with Sale, the overseer of the Brave City trial at the time, he learned that Valiant Heart Mountain would be teleporting all its candidates at once in order to save on costs. Though Lionel didn't think much of it at the time, it was clear that Valiant Heart Mountain wasn't in the best of positions at the moment if they were penny pinching to that extent. But Lionel didn't care much. He already had a great distrust of organizations. The only reason he was going was because of Aina. At least this way, he could make sure she wouldn't have to deal with any injustices. Of course, Lionel also had no idea that Sale had already reported him to the higher-ups of Valiant Heart Mountain, causing a fissure to appear in upper management. The details of this matter, though, would be left unknown to Lionel for a long while. But it seemed that those of Valiant Heart Mountain saw this as an opportunity as well. Not having any idea that the supposed Morales clan heir they were banking their futures on was completely ignorant to his status. I guess we should prepare. Lionel finally spoke. Aina nodded. I'm going to go change. Aina stood up and hesitated, seeing all the dishes that lay empty. She couldn't just leave them here. Lionel grinned. Let me watch you change and I'll wash the dishes. Aina blushed furiously, glaring at Lionel. Pervert. Lionel laughed as Aina ran away, picking up the dishes that were left. Is there a dishwasher? Lionel asked the dictionary, hoping for the best. Luckily, he wasn't disappointed. After rinsing the dishes a bit and stuffing the machine full, Lionel turned his attention to his own clothing change. Stripping off the tatters that remained of his clothing, he slipped on the white hammer pants given to him by Sale, and tightly wrapped the cloth belt around his waist. Lionel couldn't help but grin. He felt like he was Aladdin, so where was his genie? Shaking his head to get rid of his childish thoughts, Lionel adjusted the cloth belt, so that its end dangled between his legs, revealing the hidden ancient patterns. Finally, he pulled out the Egyptian-like neckwear. Heavy. Lionel thought as he had the almost solid piece of black steel in his hand. The neck piece alone was at least 50 pounds. It had quite the heft to it. Aina walked in to find Lionel changing in the kitchen. Toward such a scene, she really didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Didn't he have his own bedroom? What was he doing? Then again, now that she thought about it, Lionel's room had become the place the two of them slept in. So maybe it couldn't really be considered his room anymore. Aina blushed slightly, but quickly shook her head to tease Lionel for his ridiculous choice of location. Unfortunately, before she could, Lionel stood his full height, his back view enveloping her vision. His tan skin seemed to emit a slight sheen of bronze. The definition of his back and the way it flexed slightly with his every movement made Aina flashback to moments when her hands ran across those deep trenches. It was the kind of back she could rely on. The kind she had laid upon as Lionel stomped out her worst fears. Aina blushed from something other than embarrassment, turning her head away and pretending as though she hadn't seen anything. Why did Valiant Heart Mountain have such a provocative dress code? What Aina didn't know was that as she looked away, Lionel sensed her presence and looked back only to have the same exact thought she had had. The only difference between the male uniform and the female uniform was a second cloth band that wrapped around the chest. But this one was white to match the pants rather than being the same black as the cloth belt. However, this only served to leave Lionel short of breath. He had understood ever since that day in the bathhouse why Aina also wore that loose-fitting military garb. But seeing her wear such a thing practically stopped his heart. The way her pants clung to her hips, the subtle but feminine definition of her abs after every breath, the way her chest cloth elegantly curved to display those two delicacies that Lionel could still faintly feel on his palms. Lionel had seen his fair share of women who were even more scantily clad than this. But only Aina could make his heart flutter. Aina jumped, but she couldn't run away before Lionel's hands were already on her hips. The blush on her face had still yet to vanish, making her all the more alluring. Wait. The teleportation is. Lionel's lips sealed her own. Aina's eyes widened, but after a moment, she seemed to fall victim to Lionel's advances. Her hands found their way to that very back she was dreaming of tracing, her eyes closing as she lost herself in another world. Lionel pulled back, grinning. Aina's eyes slowly opened, only to feel as though a devil was smiling down at her. Aina looked away, trying to avoid his gaze. But what she saw in her surroundings made her want to dive back into his arms before finding a hole to crawl into. What should have been the segmented cube's kitchen had suddenly become the midway point of a mountain larger than anything Aina had ever seen. At the mountain pass, there were two pillars, each over 100 meters tall, and inscribed with the images of war and roaring beasts. Their presence alone, despite being so far away, made the gates of Brave City seem like nothing more than child's play. However, what had Aina wanting to hide away wasn't the mountain, nor the pillars, nor even the floating islands in the distance. It was the fact that there were suddenly thousands of youths around them, each at this very same mountain pass. Lionel laughed at Aina's flustered reaction. Isn't this what she gets for teasing him all the time? He finally got a bit of revenge. It tasted sweet. Now that he thought about it, she tasted quite sweet too. He almost wanted another taste. However, his good mood didn't last very long. If I had a face like that, I'd be looking for a place to hide too. Chapter 594. Lionel's expression darkened. Aina's own, which had just been filled with embarrassment, almost instantly became as still as a lake. If it wasn't for the fact that she had just been so animated, one would think that she was nothing more than a statue, a puppet that was completely unaffected by the outside world. A cold wind swept through the grounds. In truth, not many were paying attention to the situation. Though Aina and Lionel had just appeared out of seemingly thin air, so had everyone else who had come to this place. In fact, even to this very moment, there were still more youths popping up, looking wide-eyed toward the massive pillars on either side of the mountain pass. With this concentration of people, there were no doubt several conversations happening at once, especially since those from similar worlds had been teleported to the same spots much like Lionel and Aina. This was all to say that this singular sentence hardly traveled a few meters before getting lost in the hustle and bustle of the excited youths around them. In fact, it was very likely that the person who spoke these words didn't even mean for Lionel and Aina to hear them in the first place. They were just mocking and jeering from within their friend group. Yet, at that moment, Lionel's gaze turned toward the voice, easily able to pinpoint it amidst the sea of noise. The young woman who had spoken was dressed in an attire identical to Aina, as were all the women accepted into Valiant Heart Mountain. Though there seemed to be a very poor ratio of men to women in this place. There were at least 5 or 6 males to every 1 female. Unlike Aina, though, this young woman seemed to lean into her sexuality. Her cloth belt was extremely loose, allowing her pants to just barely hang from her hips. At the same time, whereas Aina's cloth wrap was large enough to even cover a portion of her belly, this woman seemed to have chosen to fold her own as narrowly as possible, causing 2 round protrusions to be just barely visible from the bottom. It was most definitely this heavenly flavor of underboob that had caused males even from other worlds to flock around her like a den of wolves. Even those males who weren't as confident in their strength observed her from a distance, trying to sneak a few more peeks in as they bet on how many rounds of battle she could last without exposing a little nipple. Lionel's gaze made the young lady accidentally bite her tongue, her pupils trembling slightly. As expected, she really hadn't thought that Lionel would hear her. But seeing his reaction made her feel as though her head had been dunked into a vat of ice. When she saw that Lionel was a man, though, she seemed to shake herself awake. Maybe she would have been scared if Aina was the one exuding this kind of pressure, but what male would deem to harm her? Maybe his world is filled with ugly women or something. To be so handsome yet pick out such a tramp, is he blind? The young woman stuck her chest out more prominently, as though to provoke Lionel into dropping his seething rage. Originally, the young lady had only commented offhandedly, not planning on confronting Aina personally. After all, she wasn't a fool. She had no idea the kind of background these people had, nor did she understand anything about their tempers. Plus, on top of that, she was a genius in her own right. She wouldn't be so bored as to go out of her way to bully someone without cause. But now that her offhanded joke had been accidentally heard, she also had no intention of backing down. This was Valiant Heart Mountain, a place where the strong thrived and the weak got eaten. If she showed weakness now, her future was practically finished. However, the glaze-over effect, her ample breasts and outrageous curves usually had seemed to fall completely flat in the face of Lionel. With a step forward, Lionel's minor action seemed to cause the ground to quake. In an instant, what was a situation hardly anyone paid attention to had suddenly become the center of focus. The young lattice expression changed, not expecting Lionel to suddenly react like this. Before she could think of how to react, though, several men stepped forward to block Lionel's path, just as Aina grabbed onto Lionel's forearm. Lionel frowned and looked back. "You cause trouble everywhere you go," Aina said lightly. "Just leave it alone, it's not a big deal." Lionel's brow furrowed. Aina's lip curled. What? You suddenly gain a little bit of strength and think it's okay to hit women now? Should I fear for myself? Maybe I should just forget about us. By the end of her words, Aina looked as though she was on the verge of tears. Lionel didn't know what to say. Sure, he had learned throughout his youth to never put hands on a woman, but that was back when their strength couldn't be compared to a man's. In this new world order, even this petite Aina's physical strength was greater than his own. Lionel was a very logical person, so the moment the foundation for his protective spirit toward women was no longer there, he likewise had no qualms about hitting and even killing them. In fact, he had already done so with a fair few from Joan all the way to Pisces. Where was the justice? How was he getting bullied for trying to defend his own woman? Lionel shook his head. You win. You win. Don't cry. Lionel's switch from murder machine to simping boyfriend was so abrupt that hardly anyone knew how to react. However, no one felt it more acutely than the young lady herself, who suddenly had a massive weight taken off her shoulders. If it wasn't for support she got from another rare female and friend, she would have collapsed. When she looked back up, her gaze was filled with resentment as she gazed toward Lionel's back. She clenched her fists, her eyes practically spewing fire. Seeing such a scene, the men who had gathered to protect her didn't seem intent on backing off after being instigated by Lionel. Chapter 595. Lionel held his hands together while appeasing Aina, an ingratiating smile on his face. He didn't even spare the group behind him a glance. Or maybe he was truly entirely focused on Aina to begin with. Aina smiled slyly, seemingly enjoying Lionel's display. Wasn't this what he got for teasing her like that? Kissing her in front of so many people, what a bad guy. All right, I'll forgive you this one time. Lionel beamed as Aina flipped a palm to reveal her blue-veined mask. She slipped it on, feeling more at ease now that the itchiness of her face was dying down. She had taken the mask off previously because she was worried about it being harmed in the kitchen. But the truth was that Lionel's crafts weren't so fragile. After all, he had designed it to have great defensive prowess. But the care she took for the gift spoke volumes about how much she appreciated it. Of course, those who had been paying attention had no idea that Aina was putting on her mask simply to alleviate the discomfort of her curse. To them, she had been ashamed by the young lad's previous words, and had now chosen to hide her face. Such a scene provoked the sneers of the men who had been trying to prove themselves to the young lady. To get angry at such a beauty for a woman that looked like that. Had someone kicked this guy in the head when he was younger? Clearly, they were dissatisfied with how Lionel was ignoring them, and even turning their back to them. But they still felt that it was no longer appropriate to lash out. Still, they marked down Lionel in their minds. The moment they learned of his background, as long as he didn't have the capital to wield such arrogance, they would let him know the consequences of trying to impress women. Obviously, they hadn't sensed the irony of their own thoughts. Miss Balthorn, are you all right? The young lady who had helped Balthorn withstand Lionel's gaze, and helped her up spoke. Despite having been admitted into the same organization, the young lady still didn't dare to be disrespectful to Balthorn. In fact, when she had made that comment about Ailsa, the young lady had even politely laughed along with the rest. The men sheathed their weapons and surrounded Balthorn as well, trying to radiate outward with a manly presence. They were all aware that Balthorn's background wasn't small. In fact, her family was a preeminent powerhouse of their quadrant. Amongst those who had come, she was most definitely amongst the most well taken care of. She was Balthorn Valinor, the young mistress of the Valinor family. The Valinor family was among the 3 most powerful on planet Krars, a world on the brink of entering the 5th dimension, and with the potential of a 6th-dimensional world. If Lionel had heard this, he would have faintly recognized the name. In fact, among the prisoners he had taken from White City, there was a man who claimed to be from planet Krars X10, a subsidiary of Krars. Back then, Aina had told Lionel that Krars was among the most powerful worlds of their quadrants. As for how large a quadrant was, Lionel had no idea. He only assumed that it was at least a few solar systems worth of space. But it was much vaster than this. Every galaxy would have at most a few hundred quadrants. Though this seemed like a large number, if one considered the enormous size of a galaxy, if a quadrant could be worth a single percentage of its size, it would be grandiose beyond imagining. At the very least, if Lionel's ancestors of the 21st century tried to cross such a distance, even their entire lifetimes wouldn't be enough. In fact, even 100 generations wouldn't be enough either. For Krars to be among the dominant forces of a quadrant, there was no doubting its strength. That said, for Balthorn to be sent to Valiant Heart Mountain, an organization that was facing such struggles, it was clear that she wasn't very important to her family. Still, compared to the background of these young men, she was light years ahead. If they could gain her favor and become her husband, they'd feel as though they had lived a fulfilled life. "I'm fine," Balthorn said somewhat weakly, her heart still beating erratically. "There's no need to worry about that coward, Balthorn. I just checked, but that weakling is still in the third dimension. There's no threat from him. I could kill him as easily as slaughtering a chicken." Balthorn's eyes flashed when she heard these words. "Third dimension? You idiot. That only means he's even more talented than you. Do you think Valiant Heart Mountain has fallen far enough to let people in just because? If that was the case, why would I bother with coming here?" Balthorn bit her lip, suddenly feeling annoyed by all the flies buzzing around her. Seeing Lionel's attention completely focused on Aina, she bit her lip harder. The dichotomy between the kind of love the two women were receiving was striking to the point of being stifling. The young lady by Balthorn's side, Henorin, gazed between the former and Aina, but in the end remained silent. In the distance, a young man watched all of this just as silently. Compared to the youths brimming with vitality around him, he seemed to have already placed a foot in his coffin. He was skinny to the point the line of his spine and his ribs were sinking against his skin. His complexion was pale to the point of being deathly, and his back curved somewhat as though his head was too heavy to carry. He gazed toward Lionel for a moment before shifting back toward Balthorn. His tongue ran over his lips as he stared her up and down, his eyes focusing on her chest for an obscene amount of time. But what was maybe more grating was the fact his tongue, rather than being a healthy pink, was a dull gray at that moment. The tall pillars of the mountain pass quaked and a portal opened within them to reveal several figures. It seemed the big shots of Valiant Heart Mountain had finally appeared. Chapter 596. Compared to the dress of the youths, the elders of Valiant Heart Mountain weren't dressed much differently at all. In fact, there were only two differences one could point out. The first was the color of their cloth belts. What dangled between their legs wasn't the black of the youths, but rather a striking red. At least, most of them wore this red as though dyed by centuries of blood. The old man that led them, though, wore one of copper, as though the blood that had once drenched his had rusted over with age. The second difference was a shawl draped over their shoulders. This matched the color of their cloth belts, giving them a more dignified appearance than the kids below. The old man's exposed torso was just as hollowed out as the pale young man from before. But though his body seemed worn with age, his back was as straight as a javelin despite the fact he simultaneously used a walking stick. The atmosphere fell into silence as this group of five walked forward. One could feel the difference between realms of existence when standing before the powerful. Though these five elders had yet to speak a word, it felt as though there was a mountain weighing down on them all, as though they wouldn't be satisfied until they all kneeled in deference. Though the dimensions felt like power levels, this wasn't the case. In fact, only talents like Lionel and Aina would feel this way. Like crossing dimensions and evolving to a higher state of being was no different than crossing any other barrier. However, to middling existences, the barrier between dimensions was akin to heaven and earth. There was no doubt that each and every one of these elders stood as a fifth-dimensional entity, a barrier that more than half of those here would never even cross, let alone travel so deeply into. This was a strength that they idealized, that they aspired to, that they respected from the deepest recesses of their hearts. "Stop playing around." Lionel felt a strong elbow to his side and coughed lightly. He looked up to see what all the commotion was about, only to find that no one dared to even breathe too harshly. When he saw the elders at the very front, he raised his brows. Lionel felt like a refreshing breeze was wrapping around his body. Unfortunately, he couldn't enjoy it very much because he seemingly only now remembered that he was still injured. Though Aina's food had helped him along, he was still only about 70% of his normal self, which was a miracle unto itself considering the state of his inner organs previously. Now that Lionel thought about it, Aina's food was definitely not enough for such a drastic improvement. Was he missing something? Oh, Lionel suddenly remembered the odd state he had entered when he was completing his divine armor. Back then, he had vaguely felt an energy integrating with his body and improving it. If it wasn't for the fact he hadn't been swallowing any metal essence at that moment, his metal body might have already improved to tier 3 or 4 by now. It was only now that Lionel understood that that feeling must have come from the energy he absorbed from the puppet master. Due to how powerful Lionel had become, he had almost forgotten that defeating invalids could improve his strength. But this wasn't really his fault. He was so powerful, but Earth only had third-dimensional invalids to deal with. Those existences could barely move the needle for him. Yet he had gone from third-dimensional invalids to a variant invalid on the verge of entering the 5th dimension. The difference was striking. It was no wonder the puppet master's residual energy had such a great benefit to him. In fact, now that he was paying attention, Lionel could tell that he had only absorbed about 20 or 30% of the energy. Unfortunately, his body was too injured to absorb any more or improve any further. It seemed he would have to focus on healing. By now, his healing branch ability could allow him to heal back to a perfect state immediately. But it seemed a waste to use in this situation considering how long it took to recharge. Forget it, be patient for now. The elders scanned the crowd in silence, allowing the youths to soak up the feeling of being in their presence. This wasn't just for the sake of showing off their might. It was also to give them a goal to aspire to while also making their authority unquestionable. Every organization was built from the bottom up. The more obedient and simultaneously ambitious their fresh blood was, the better. But in this crowd of serious youths, the one individual with an absent-minded gaze couldn't help but stand out. It also most definitely didn't help that there was a small clearing around this person. And also that this person was far taller than most on average. Several gazes landed on Lionel. The change should have been enough to shock him awake. But Lionel continued to be lost in his own world as though his daydreaming was far more important than anything happening here. Of course, he wasn't doing this on purpose. What these elves thought should have been obvious pressure was like a spring breeze to Lionel. If it wasn't for Aina pinching his waist and startling him, he probably wouldn't notice at all. Seeing the gazes of the elders, Lionel smiled lightly and stood at attention, respectfully keeping his hands to his sides. There was truly nothing about his actions that the elders could pick out. But their lips couldn't help but twitch regardless. The old man at the front swept his gaze over Lionel one more time before he began to speak. Do you all see these pillars to my back? The shuffling of necks resounded through the mountain pass as they all looked upward. These pillars are the foundation of Valiant Heart Mountain. You all might not understand now, but this is our home, our lifeblood, our heart. You all may think that since you have made it here, you can be considered members of our Valiant Heart Mountain. However, to me, unless you can walk through these gates on your own, you will never be. Even if you die before my eyes, I'll never raise a finger to help you. Luckily for you brats, my methods were deemed too cruel. So you have 3 years to walk through these gates on your own 2 feet. That said, even if I don't have my way, I also have no intention of letting you all go so easily. Below this mountain pass, there are numerous beasts. Some of them are tagged while some of them are not. These tags carry the teleportation talismans you need to enter the mountain peak without crossing these gates. There are 3,802 of you here. There are exactly 1901 tagged beasts. Among these tags, there are 10 golden tags that will allow you 1 trip to the Valiant Vault. You have 12 hours. The wind around the youths suddenly stilled to a crawl. Chapter 597. The atmosphere froze for just a moment before the youths suddenly erupted into movement. What once was an orderly field of promising geniuses became akin to a mosh pit. But in this context, with the strength of the people in question, it felt as though this mountain that Valiant Heart had called home for so long might collapse. Earth cracked, air crackled. The sounds of shouts of anger and pain sounded as the so-called geniuses fought and jostled for position. each trying to make their way down the mountain faster than the last. In what felt like no more than half a minute, over 90% of the field had been completely dispersed. As for those that remained, they had long since been trampled by the crowd to the point of being on their last breaths. There was no doubt that amidst all the chaos, some had taken advantage of the situation to get rid of some competition. However, true to his word, the old man didn't raise a single finger, watching these youths with broken bodies bleed out without a single word. Aside from a sweep of his gaze, he spared them nothing more, even as some of them begged and pleaded. Still, there were a few that seemed to stand out. Geniuses who had kept their calm even in the face of such harsh elimination requirements. There was the pale youth who was, even now, still intently staring at Baltorn. There was a burly young man with twin short sabers strapped to his back. Juxtaposed to his size, they felt more like curved daggers than saber-like weapons. There was a young woman whose hair was pulled into two ponytails that combined down her chest. And finally, there was Balthorn herself. Each stared at the gates intently, unwilling to take their eyes off of it. Of course, with the exception of the pale youth. Among these youths were Lionel and Aina, who hadn't moved from the very beginning. But rather than having done so out of curiosity, their reasoning was far different from the norm. Rather, Lionel had begun teasing Aina before she could even think of the next step she wanted to take. But after a while, Lionel raised his head to take a look at all the carnage. With furrowed brows he raised a hand. Grand heel. Strong light elemental force descended from the skies, falling onto the bodies of the youths who lay bleeding out on the ground. If they were really left for just a few more minutes, it was likely that of them would survive. This minor action caused Lionel to once again become the center of attention. The old man raised an eyebrow, but he couldn't exactly become mad at Lionel's actions. After all, there was no rule against this. Light elemental force? The gaze of the elders and youths sharpened. This was no longer Earth where there were talents at every corner. In such a place, Lionel's light elemental force stuck out like a sore thumb. There wasn't a soul here who didn't understand just how rare light elemental force was. The youths who had been focused on the two pillars looked back toward Lionel, a hint of seriousness in their expressions. But Lionel simply cast Grand Heal, again and again, lamenting the fact his healing capabilities were still severely lacking. It was only after the last person's life was no longer in danger that he came to a stop and turned his attention toward Aina. What do you think? Lionel was only here to follow truthfully. He had come here not because he wanted to, but because of Aina. So he would let her take the lead. The easiest method is to just cross the gates on our own. Aina replied. Lionel looked around. It was clear that they weren't the only one with this idea. Even that woman, Baltorn, was standing here in preparation to go about the same thing. The whole idea of finding then fighting beasts just sounded like a hassle. If one didn't have acute senses like Lionel, you were practically relying on luck. What is your goal for coming here, though? What do you want to accomplish? Aina's gaze sharpened. To become as strong as possible. Lionel grinned. Aina's resolve even making the small hairs on his skin stand at attention. In that case, let's go catch some beasts. Aina blinked, looking at Lionel with a hint of confusion. Wasn't looking for the beasts a waste of time? Why was Lionel suddenly talking about going after them now? However, Lionel didn't explain, taking Aina's small hand and leaving a streak of gold in his wake as he dashed into the forest. The old man raised an eyebrow, watching Lionel's back retreat. But in the end he shook his head. He had thought that he had run into a talent, but this one actually made the same choice as all the others. This action alone considerably dulled whatever surprise Lionel's light elemental force had given them. They were called Valiant Heart Mountain for a reason. Talent was secondary to them. What was most important was what was within a person's heart. If Lionel wasn't willing to fight and put his life on the line, what worth did his talent have? The youth seemed to agree with the old man's assessment. They had thought that they met another rival, only for him to be a coward. It was quite disappointing indeed. Ironically, it was only Balthorn who looked toward Lionel's receding back with an eyebrow raised. That man. What was he thinking? Unbeknownst to Balthorn, she had already become curious about Lionel. A woman's mind was complex indeed. Why she would feel such a way about a man who had been moments away from killing her just a while ago was beyond normal human understanding. Unfortunately, before she could think any longer, the burly man with twin sabers stepped forward, his heavy steps causing the ground to quake. "My name is Inkith Miadan. I don't need your tags. I will climb up this mountain on my own 2 feet. His roar caused the birds in the surroundings to shoot into the skies. Who knew when they would be confident enough to return to their nests? Chapter 598. Inkith feet stomped forward as he began to make his way up the mountain, his eyes completely focused on the pillars before him. Though the elders of Valiant Heart Mountain stood between the pillars, the youths themselves were a ways down the mountain, a few hundred meters from the foot of the gates. In fact, from their position, sensing the pressure of the gates was impossible. So, in the beginning, Inkith sensed nothing and continued to walk forward and up courageously. However, the instant he crossed the 300-meter line to the gates, a roar suddenly shook his mind. It was so loud and sudden that blood began to ooze from his ears. Despite this, Inkith remained on his own 2 feet, his expression finally growing serious. This roar had no tangible owner. In fact, it looked as though he was the only one to have heard it at all. The elders at the top continued to stand there as though nothing happened, and the youths to his back who had yet to make a move were only watching him without saying a word. It wasn't until blood began dripping from Inkith's ears that the latter group began to feel like something was wrong. However, it was at that exact moment that Inkith began to laugh, beating his fists against his brawny chest until his darkish skin became red. A strong surge of force erupted from him as he shot forward. A barrage of bestial roars assaulted his psyche, making his every step heavy and his every movement labored. But he continued to charge upward, his muscles rippling with vitality and ferocity. The young lady with twin ponytails braided to combine at her chest blinked with curiosity. After a while of watching, she too stepped forward. Irelana of the Phaex tribe. She spoke softly, neatly patting her hair down as she too began to walk up. Balthorn, and the pale youth didn't move for a long while. "If you keep staring at me like that, I'm going to dig your eyes out," Balthorn said coldly. The pale youth began to cackle. "Your tits are practically out for all to see, yet you don't want me to look. Is there no justice in this world? You want to die?" Balthorn turned toward the pale youth, her proud chest swaying with her movements like a rippling tide. "As long as it's by your hands, I think you'll enter my coffin with a happy expression on my face," Balthorn scoffed. "I don't like scrawny men." The pale youth continued to cackle. "Let me guess, you like tall, bronzed, and handsome men who already have girlfriends?" Balthorn's glare became sharp. However, toward such a response, the pale youth's cackling only became louder. In fact, it seemed to take so much energy out of him that he just might keel over and die at any moment. Though she didn't respond, her lack of one only seemed to make her more guilty. "AI women, women, women. I'll never understand them. Those brats that were flocking around you like a pack of hyenas just ran off, swearing to get you a tag or die trying. Yet you're standing here thinking about a man who would have killed you for another woman. What should I call you exactly?" Balthorn's sharp gaze gave way to a curling smile. "What should you call me? How about a beauty you can gaze upon at your own risk, but can never touch regardless?" With these words said, Balthorn strode forward, clearly having no intention of waiting for those white knights of hers to retrieve a tag in her stead. As for the trouble they got into trying to do such a thing, she didn't care either. "Balthorn Valinor," she said simply and sweetly. Bowing once, she stepped onto the mountain pass. "Wait for me, beauty." The pale youth finally moved. As though a shadow, he appeared by Balthorn as though he had always been there. "My name is Radlease," the pale youth spoke, but it seemed that his words were aimed more for Balthorn than the elders above. Aina followed after Lionel with a raised eyebrow, but in the end, she didn't say anything to stop him. As far as she was concerned, Lionel wouldn't do anything to harm her. Plus, even if they fell behind by a step, it didn't really matter much. They were young and time was on their side. Who was better and who was worse would be clear soon enough. The two hopped through the trees, streaking past groups of confused youths trying to find beasts to tackle of their own. Among these groups that they passed by, There were no small number of them that were already locked into their own fights to the death. There were over 3,800 participants, but only 1,900 beasts. Even when one found a beast to attack, there was no guarantee that there wouldn't be 10 others fighting you to do the same. In a lot of ways, this sort of trial was even more difficult than the trial above. Lionel shook his head as he watched the carnage beneath him. But this time he didn't raise a finger to help. This was different from before. These were men and women fighting for their futures, who lived and died here would be up to themselves. After a long while, Aina finally couldn't help her curiosity any longer. What's your goal? How will this help? She continued to allow Lionel to pull her along, seemingly enjoying the feeling of his hand enveloping her own. But she still didn't want to be kept in the dark. Shushu. We're here. Lionel used a combination of Camelot's silencing spells to achieve the effect of sending his voice directly to Aina once again. The two came to a grinding halt atop a tall tree. Down below, there was what appeared to be a large black bear. It had the characteristic tough fur and large, round body. It even had the rounded ears down perfectly. The only difference was that instead of having light fur around its snout, its own had a fiery shade of red fur. In fact, its eyes were the same striking crimson as though it was prepared and ready to tear anything down at any moment. This? A bear? Aina asked within Lionel's bubble. Lionel grinned. You see a bear. But I see our first golden tag. Aina's eyes widened, suddenly understanding what Lionel wanted to do. Chapter 599. Seeing Aina's reaction, Lionel grinned and suddenly jumped down from the tree, a massive spear suddenly appearing in his hands. This spear was other than the one he likened to a hammer. But in this situation, it was perfect. Lionel's eyes flashed, a golden domain spreading out around him. In that instant, not only did he become 10 times heavier, but so did the over 5,000-pound spear in his hand. The red-nosed bear suddenly sensed something. It looked up into the skies, a snarl taking over its features. It rose to its hind legs, roaring to the point of foggy, spittle-filled breath assaulting Lionel. A strong red force erupted around the bear, its body growing a size as its fur stood on end. It swiped a paw at the descending Lionel, imagining smashing this pesky human into meat paste. But at the instant spear and paw met, an overwhelming strength assaulted the bear. Its bones creaked and groaned, before reaching their breaking point and suddenly snapping. A cry of pain left the beast, but its crimson gaze only seemed to become even more so. Lionel shifted his weight until it was as light as a feather, landing on the ground with subtle steps before shooting forward. He gripped the massive spear with both hands, his palms and fingers not large enough to even wrap all the way around its shaft. Yet he wielded it as though it was no different from an extension of himself. Lionel sent a strong sweep across, pressing down on the injured beast. At that moment he suddenly winced, feeling the fine cracks in his ribs he had been ignoring to this point. His attack slowed by just a margin, allowing the red-nosed bear to erupt with an even stronger red force. The beast's healthy paw swung downward, coated by a blazing energy. The air in the surroundings heated up, the billowing roars of the bear tearing through the forest's canopy. Bang! The two attacks collided. Lionel's feet sunk into the soft soil, his knees bending and buckling. This beast's strength was no small matter. Lionel could tell why the old man had chosen it to be among those that carried the golden tags. By Lionel's estimation, this beast was at least as strong as a city lord of Terrain, which was about tier 6 of the 4th dimension. Of course, Terrain wasn't exactly known for its talent, so its standard of tier 6 was much lower than that of other worlds. Still, this kind of beast was difficult for Lionel to defeat without using the Four Seasons realm, activating his runes, or using his dreamscape battle sense. Without the help of these factors, Lionel believed that he was actually far worse than this bear. He was only now bridging the gap thanks to two things. The first was his ability. Even without dreamscape battle sense, Lionel's senses were far beyond what most could even aspire to, let alone claim to have. So his reactions and calculations in battle were perfect. The second was the most obvious. His weapon. Lionel was using a quasi-bronze weapon, a treasure a half-step from the 5th dimension, against a beast in the middling fourth-dimensional realms. There was no wonder he was able to stand his ground. If this was all, things would be fine. Lionel would still be confident in defeating this beast without tapping into his true strength. But unfortunately, he was still injured. Just as Lionel was about to clash with the bear again, a shadow suddenly fell from the skies and landed before him. The shadow seemed to only shift slightly, but the roaring of the bear came to an end, just as quickly. Lionel, who had been about to prepare himself for a tough battle, sighed and lowered his spear. You could have at least pretended that it was difficult. Lionel mumbled. Aina looked back innocently, her eyes blinking behind her mask. Is your ego so fragile? Every man's ego is fragile. Lionel defended himself. Aina giggled. Alright, I don't mind taking a step back then. You go. Lionel was about to puff up his chest in pride when he suddenly thought of something and turned a gloomy eye toward Aina. Unable to hold it back any longer, Aina burst into a fit of laughter, clenching at her stomach. Go on now, manly man. Do your job. Disgruntled, Lionel could only step forward. Kneeling beside the beast's corpse, and to the tune of Aina's laughter, he began to cut open the beast's stomach and dig his way through before he finally found the golden tag he was looking for. He stood and tried to turn toward Aina, but she scurried away before he could even approach. She pinched at her nose, still unable to stop her laughter. Do you feel more manly now? Lionel looked at the bloody, organ-littered, half-eaten food-covered mess in his hand, half wanting to cry and half wanting to vomit. This girlfriend of his was too cruel. Aina and Lionel shot through the forest, easily finding one golden tag after another. It seemed as though they had a cheat of some sort. The reality, though, wasn't that far from the truth. As the old man had said, each tag was capable of teleporting the one who claimed it past the mountain pass. But the unspoken truth of this was that any beast with this tag was likewise marked by the force arts necessary to allow such teleportation. After realizing this for Lionel, the matter was simple. His internal sight didn't have a very large range in this world. There was no doubt that this place was a fifth-dimensional world. And as such, not only was the space in Lionel's spatial ring smaller here, but the range of his internal sight was only a few dozen meters to 100 meters at most. However, the fluctuations in these force arts caused small ripples in space. Normally, one wouldn't be able to sense these ripples at all. Not only was the space elemental affinity even more rare than the light elemental affinity, but even if you had it, it was unlikely to be very strong. Lionel, however, had just completed his divine armor, giving him space elemental affinity, no worse than almost anyone within the fourth dimension. Though this affinity would be useless to him after he outgrew his divine armor, and was somewhat weaker without summoning the armor itself, this still remained true. Using this affinity, Lionel could easily pick out these tiny changes in space. And once he locked onto a beast, it was a simple matter of using his internal sight to see whether the tag was gold or not. Beyond that, since he knew that the gold tags would only be in beasts of certain strength, he could just as easily not waste time scanning beasts that were too weak. Like this, Lionel and Aina tore through the mountain range, easily grasping all 10 gold tags without the slightest hint of effort. Well, the effort was minimal on Aina's part. As for the poor sap that was Lionel, he would have to take at least a dozen showers before he felt clean. Chapter 600. There's got to be a better self-cleaning spell than this. Lionel sighed, looking down at himself with a helpless expression. He really got taken advantage of this time around. Though he had already tried to cast several water elemental cleansing spells, his water affinity was so low that it hardly made a difference. To make matters worse, in this fifth-dimensional world, as someone who had yet to touch upon this barrier, affinity was even more important. The higher tier the world, the more it took to move its force. So, all of Lionel's attempts resulted in a light drizzle of water that made Aina sputter with laughter. Still, this didn't stop the two from easily taking down the 10th beast. Now what? Aina asked. Standing over the massive deer with steel-like horns lying beneath them, Lionel pondered for a moment. With these tags, teleporting to the core of Valiant Heart Mountain shouldn't be a problem. Having them in their grasp meant that their task was basically complete. However, Before Lionel could answer, a rustling of leaves caught his attention. Under normal circumstances, Lionel would dismiss it as passing wind. With his senses, it was unlikely for anyone to approach so closely without him noticing, least of all those youths who had chosen to come after these tags rather than challenge the mountain pass directly. But for the first time in a long while, Lionel felt a tingling in his spine. He remembered this feeling well. It was the feeling he got whenever the primitive man's consciousness warned him of something. By now, Lionel had lost count of the number of primitive male and female consciousnesses he had consumed the lives of. Originally, he hadn't thought it would have a great impact on him going into the future, but the more he absorbed, the sharper these instinctive reactions of his became. Ironically, when he was in his cold and calculating battle style, these instincts were dulled considerably. But whenever he was relaxed and not expecting much, exactly like he was now, those feelings would fire off. Aina seemed to have noticed that something was off as well. Previously, with their senses, they could make out the battles that had been happening in the distance. Considering the number of young geniuses versus the land they had to work with, it was no surprise that the next closest group wouldn't be more than a few hundred meters from you. But at this moment, they heard nothing. Lionel's lip curled. It seems we have company. At that moment, Lionel wished he had a beard to stroke. But just as always, his face was as bare as a baby's bottom. Do you think you can scare them off with your scent? Lionel coughed. His lack of a beard already ruined his cool moment, but this was just a nail in his coffin. Where was the love and support? Aina giggled, underlaid an increase in the shuffling grass. I wonder, though, if this person has an ability that can cut off my senses. Why is it that they've left behind this shuffling grass? Lionel thought aloud. It was clear that neither he nor Aina was taking this matter very seriously. Or rather, it seemed that they weren't. The truth was that both had already gone on high alert. Everyone participating had already seen the disregard the elders had for the fallen youths. There was clearly an unspoken rule that anything went during these trials. Even if one or two people wouldn't be difficult to deal with. What if it was dozens? At that moment, as though a veil had been undone, the surroundings were filled with hidden shadows. Beneath the shade of the trees and the foliage of the greenery, Lionel counted the movement of at least 30 individuals. They surrounded the couple from all sides, and though Lionel couldn't clearly see their faces just yet, there was no doubt their intent wasn't to exchange niceties. Lionel didn't seem too surprised by this outcome. There were too many people here. Hiding the actions of both he and Aina were almost impossible. There was no doubt that they had been sighted jumping around the forest many times. One or two battles would have been fine. After all, there were only 2 of them, so they obviously needed to fight 2 battles to get enough tags. But, after the 10th, only a fool wouldn't be able to catch on to what was happening. The only thing Lionel was actually disappointed in was not sensing them previously. But after some thought, he realized that whoever planned this was quite clever in their own right. For Lionel to be able to so easily pinpoint the golden tags, it would have been obvious to anyone observing that he had great sensory abilities. In that case, how could they not come prepared to deal with this? When the faces finally came into view, Lionel raised an eyebrow. He recognized a few, namely the young lady who had been by Balthorn's side, Henorin. But following her were several youths that had been flocking around Balthorn, as though she was a goddess. Somehow though, despite how rowdy these youths were, Lionel got the faint feeling that they were following Henorin's directive. It was an odd feeling indeed, especially considering the young lady was in the middle of the group, lightly clasping her hands together at her waist as though she didn't plan on raising a single finger. Despite Lionel's feelings, though, the one who stepped forward wasn't Henorin at all, but rather a young man who had threatened to skewer him with a weapon for the sake of Balthorn not even a few hours ago. The sneer on the man's face could make a baby cry. Lionel was certain of it. You know why we're all here, let's not beat around the bush. I've already let you go once and have no intention of doing it again. Hand over the tags you've collected, and you might leave this place unscathed. Lionel sighed inwardly. You really couldn't underestimate this world of abilities. Even the weaklings could catch you off guard if they were lucky enough. That said, Lionel yawned beside himself. Though he had just awoken from a few days' long rest not long ago, he had a massive meal right afterward, then proceeded to battle in this damned forest for the next few hours. With how weak his body was currently, he already felt like taking another nap. "Let's go." Lionel spoke to Aina. The sneer on the young man's face deepened. But, just as quickly it froze. A black surfboard appeared to Lionel's feet, and he grabbed at Aina. Instinctively, Aina wanted to dodge. "I'd rather fight to the death," she protested. But Lionel grinned, giving her a massive bear hug as they shot into the skies. "Bye." Lionel waved. Chapter 601. The youths were absolutely stunned. A flying treasure? What kind of joke was this? Of all the ways they expected things to end, this was the very last. This wasn't because they were too stupid to consider it a possibility, but rather because wasting time considering such a thing would have been exactly that, a waste of time. One had to understand that everything changed when one rose in the dimensions. Just like there were some airplanes that couldn't rise above a certain altitude without stalling, the same logic applied to the flying treasures of the dimensional verse. The flying treasures these youths were used to were only tier 4 or 5 black-grade treasures at best. These kind of flying treasures would hardly rise 10 meters into the air in a fifth-dimensional world. Knowing this, why would they even consider this to be a problem? They had no way of knowing that Lionel had a tier 9 black-grade treasure. He was easily able to rise up 20 meters before he even began to feel some resistance. The young man who headed their mission, a youth who went by the name of Emerald, was just as shocked as everyone else. But he also reacted quickly. "Shoot them down." Unfortunately, by the time the words had come out, Lionel and Aina were already 25 meters above the ground. Not enough. Using the trees as cover, Lionel weaved in and out of the foliage, making use of the terrain to protect both himself and Aina. However, in the back of his mind he was already planning to improve this surfboard. He could feel that it was working hard just to keep him this high off the ground. Any higher and it might collapse entirely. Luckily, the forest landscape was in Lionel's favor. Getting out of range of the youths below was a simple matter of planning a path and following suit. Not only was Lionel able to pick out those with long-ranged abilities, he was also able to project their lines of sight in his mind as well. After that, avoiding them was as easy as breathing. Not having expected such a result, Emerald hadn't even prepared a large corps of ranged units. He could only watch as Lionel shot through the skies and disappeared. Damn it. Emerald punched a thick tree hard. Yet despite his strength, barely a dent was made. He looked no different from a mortal of the third dimension completing the same exact action. Henneren's eyes narrowed as Lionel disappeared over the horizon. But she didn't pursue. She could tell that these matters were already as good as over. Aina wheezed and dry heaved under the chorus of Lionel's laughter. "Karma is a beautiful thing." Aina glared at him through her mask, but dry heaved again just as she was about to come back with a smart reply. You should probably take your mask off if you want to vomit, just saying." Lionel grinned. But in response, he only got another glare. The two landed in the same mountain pass they had been in when they were first teleported to this planet. Truthfully, Lionel had just wanted to teleport to Valiant Heart Mountain immediately, but Aina insisted that being baptized by the pressure of the pillars was good training. The elder of Valiant Heart Mountain had been in a good mood. Though he had said that he wouldn't accept any youths who could cross these gates, and that they would have 3 years to do so or be kicked out. The truth was that he said that every year. These pillars were actually a portal to Valiant Heart Mountain's sacred land, and only disciples of the highest standing even had a chance to enter that place. Of course, at the moment, this portal wasn't active. So, even if these youths managed to cross it, it wouldn't be much more than a symbolic victory. But the elder was also aware that the earlier these youths crossed this trial, the more benefit they would gain from it in the future. So during every acceptance ceremony, he would tease the youths in this exact way, forcing them to walk up the mountains. Those who were able to make it even halfway were rewarded by him. Not only would they gain his favor, but he would personally kill the beasts that held the golden tags and hand them over as a reward. The truth was that the beasts were just a bait, especially the golden tag ones. For one, amongst the beasts, There were many without tags at all. The smart youths who were more confident in their strength would think of targeting the more powerful beasts. It made sense, the more powerful a beast, the more likely it would have a golden tag. Though this might be true, the reality was much harsher. Though the elder had followed these rules, he had also left behind several dummies. Some of these dummies didn't have tags at all, while most only had normal tags. The elder thought himself to be quite clever. He believed that only youths with the greatest courage would choose to challenge the mountain pass, while the others weren't worth considering at all. Of course, he didn't even consider the fact that battling beasts and putting your life on the line against the most powerful of them was also a form of courage. But given his age, he had long since been set in his ways. And it especially didn't help in changing his mind that the youths from this year seemed to be far more talented than the norm. It couldn't help but bring a bright smile to his face. Inkith had crossed the 80% mark already and was just 60 or so meters from the pillar. Iranla was not far behind, being less than 5 meters from the back of the hulking giant. And this was most likely due to the fact she had started a step later. Balthorn was struggling the worst of the four of them. Droplets of sweat beaded down her pretty face and blood leaked from her lips as her every step seemed to cause her no small amount of damage. But she continued to trudge forward. Just be my girlfriend, and I'll carry you up. Come on. Radley's almost seemed unaffected. If it wasn't for the fact his back was hunched just a little bit more, others would think he really was immune. But at the moment, Balthorn wanted nothing more than to cut off his tongue. The elder suddenly looked up to find Lionel and Aina landing in the opening, his brow furrowed with confusion. You stay here, you're still injured. Aina said strictly. I'll go. This isn't very important to you anyway. You just want to get away from the stink, don't you? Yes. Aina held nothing back. No love in this world. Aina felt glad she was wearing a mask at that moment. If not for it, she wouldn't be able to hide her smile. Alright, I'm going. Under the stunned gazes of everyone, Aina suddenly began to sprint up the mountain pass. Chapter 602. Lionel's lip curled into a smile, but he didn't chase after Aina. She was right, his body really was in no condition to deal with such pressure. Though the other youths couldn't sense it by standing where he was now, Lionel's senses were too sharp not to. Those pillars made Brave City look like nothing more than a joke. And Lionel was absolutely certain that this was only a fraction of the strength these pillars could display. It seemed like nothing more than a coincidence that the elders were standing before them like that. But Lionel had a feeling that if they were to move away, let alone traveling up so far as those four had already done, they might not even make it 10% of the way through. That said, as long as those elders kept nerfing the mountain pass oppression, Lionel had the utmost confidence in Aina. As though blazing a trail, Aina shot up the mountain, making it from Lionel's side to the 300-meter mark in the blink of an eye. She seemed to embody the perfect form of a sprinter with her every movement. There was no wasted energy, no unnecessary movements. She almost felt no different from a machine designed to kill. Though Lionel could replicate this feat by undergoing several calculations before deciding just which form of running suited him best, Aina was different. She needed to rely on nothing other than her talent and intuition, leaving her in a realm all to her own. The elders thought that Aina was clearly overestimating herself. To have little to no regard for the mountain pass in such a way, even sprinting up as though it was a race rather than what it truly was, a fight to the death. They could only conclude that much. Even Inkith had slowly crossed this line of demarcation before slowly building up momentum. But Aina didn't even take a deep breath before crossing over the line. Of course, one reason for this was because Aina's senses were considerably dulled due to her curse. In fact, if it wasn't for her sight and hearing being so abnormal, her sensory perception would be no better than a normal human's. So, truthfully, she didn't sense the line of division as clearly as everyone else did. But on the other hand, it hardly mattered. Aina shot through the line. Her first step sunk her body so low that it seemed as though she might trip over and fall, the pressure bearing down on her shoulders relentlessly. But she recovered quickly, her thigh bulging with strength as she sprung upward. As though a blade cutting through a curtain of falling water, she sliced through, leaping forward 10 meters in a single bound. Lionel's lip curled more prominently. One would have thought that it was him accomplishing such a feat rather than Aina. But, in his mind, there was little difference between the two. The elder's eyes widened. To recover so quickly after a change in gravity without faltering, and even more importantly, without hurting oneself, was, well, the elder could only say that it should have been impossible. In that instant he was certain that Aina should have, at least, broken her planting leg. But her muscles recovered and protected the bones they surrounded as though they had a mind of their own. The time they had to react? It was other than the split moment between Aina raising her foot and it landing on the ground. It simply didn't make sense for a young girl at the beginning stages of the fourth dimension to have such fast reaction time. And it was even more impossible for her to have honed such instincts so quickly. But, even as the elder was lost in his shock, Aina had already barreled through another 40 meters, crossing the 50-meter mark with no sign of slowing down. Her body crackled and popped, her bones threatening to fracture and break. But to Aina, this sort of trial was nothing. She was a woman who trained herself by breaking her own bones, rending her inner organs, and sweating until what came out was nothing less than streams of her own blood. Such tortures, such horrors, they meant nothing. She faced the howling beasts in her mind as though she had something to prove, as though there was nothing more important to her at this very moment than to face them boldly and confidently. The fear she felt when facing the puppet master was a blemish she had long since seared into her heart. It wasn't a humiliation in the way a man might feel it. Aina just felt as though she had let herself down. That was the first time she had ever faced true death, the first time she had realized that her talent wasn't enough to leap over the final hurdle. While Lionel had to deal with such a feeling upon entering his first zone, Aina most definitely did not. She had been training ever since she was a youth. To her, her first zone was nothing more than a formality. It could be said that this was the first time she had had to face the fear of not being strong enough, of being inadequate. It was quite the feeling indeed. Because she had lost control of her body and had been unable to move, she had no way of telling herself that she had faced the trial bravely. As such, the feeling of helplessness and self-blame only seemed to cycle and grow. Lionel watched Aina tear her way up the mountain, a light smile still on his face. He knew well that the scared little girl he saw that day wasn't his Aina. Unfortunately, unable to move, she hadn't been able to prove that clearly to herself. This time, Lionel was content to take a back seat and allow the limelight to shine on her. His smile suddenly spread into a grin. If my girlfriend is so amazing, doesn't that mean I get bonus points? Chapter 603. Ha! Radleys and Balthorn looked back in confusion. In truth, of the four youthful geniuses had been paying attention. Or rather, they simply didn't have the luxury to do so. Walking up the mountain pass was difficult enough. How could they have time to waste on looking back? But, at a certain point, it simply couldn't be ignored any longer. The rushing winds, the trembling grounds, the second oppressive aura that seemed to be bearing down on them from the back. They simply couldn't continue to pay attention to the path before them any longer. When they did finally look back and see what was happening, their eyes couldn't help but widen in shock. By now, Aina was already no more than 10 meters behind them. But just as quickly as they gazed back, they were leveled just as fast. And, even faster than that, they were surpassed. Radleys and Balthorn stumbled. Their loss of concentration made them feel as though the pressure on their bodies had been multiplied several times over. And in the end, they all but fell to their knees. Aina blazed a trail by them. To an outside observer, she was only sprinting as fast as a normal human, a speed that was less than impressive for a fourth-dimensional existence. However, in the face of these youths, she might as well have been flying. A gaze of determination lit Aina's every step forward. Even though her speed was continuously slowing, she seemed to show no intention of stopping. She pushed harder and harder, her steps eventually becoming so heavy that miniature cracks began to appear beneath her feet. At some unknown time, Lionel had crossed his arms, his fingernails digging into his biceps. But at the same time, the smile on his face didn't fade, almost as though to keep up a strong front just in case she looked back. Aina entered a 50-meter distance from Inkith. Then 40. Then 30. Her arms and legs moved in unison, as though swimming through a tide of heavy water. Though her face was blocked by a mask, the weight of her determination alone painted a broader picture than what her expression alone could bring across. Even Lionel had underestimated just how much this matter meant. He had only come here for Aina's sake, but it wasn't until this moment that he truly grasped the kind of determination it took for a young woman to send herself across the universe alone, and without backers. Aina had never thought of coming to Valiant Heart Mountain with Lionel. In fact, maybe she thought that after being sent to Terrain, she would never see Lionel again. It might have been cruel, especially since at the time she hadn't even been aware of if Lionel managed to survive or not. But Lionel couldn't find it within himself to blame her for this. The relationship between he and Aina was still nothing more than a teenage infatuation. However, the weight Aina carried on her shoulders was far more than just this. She carried the betrayal of her family. She carried the scars of a little girl. She carried the death of a parent. Lionel couldn't blame her if she placed these things ahead of him in importance. It would be nothing short of selfish of him to not understand. Maybe in a way, to Aina, the act of ignoring her feelings for him was just another form of sacrifice. Another hardship she had to face to reach the day she could lay down these burdens. That drive, that will to reach a goal no matter what you had to sacrifice. Though Lionel couldn't understand it, he respected it down to the depths of his heart. He couldn't help but wonder if he'd ever have such great drive. Would there ever be something he was willing to give up everything for? The thought made him shudder. Did he really have to give up the things that he loved for the sake of such a goal? Lionel looked up into the skies. Even if there comes a day where I have such a goal, I would never be able to do that. No, Lionel shook his head. He didn't feel as though he was expressing his own thoughts properly. He had emotions deep within him, emotions he knew existed but couldn't quite place a label on. At that moment, Lionel suddenly smiled. Aina said it best. We men are selfish and always want more. And the man I want to be doesn't just want more, he wants everything. Even if there comes a day where I have such a goal, even if it forces me at an impasse where I must choose between the things that I love, I'll cut a path down the middle and take both. I don't like to lose after all. Lionel's aura shifted, a breeze kicking up around him. For a moment, the elder atop the mountain pass took his eyes off of the blazing Aina, and couldn't help but gaze upon the inconspicuous youth standing amidst a vast nothingness. Even with his years of experience, he didn't understand why he had looked at Lionel in that moment. In fact, even if he asked Lionel why, the young man wouldn't be able to answer either. Lionel's thoughts seemed to have been formulated into words and coherent thought, but the truth was that he didn't think those phrases and sentences just now. In fact, his mind was quite blank at the moment, not exuding anything close to a coherent stream of consciousness. The current Lionel was still not able to put these emotions into words. Rather, those words represented nothing more than a raw, unrefined ambition. The first budding of a sprout yet to be properly watered. Maybe even Lionel didn't realize it at that moment, but he suddenly felt free and unbothered. He was content to bide his time and wait. Wait for the moment that small bud bloomed forth. Aina gave a resounding cry into the skies, her axe appearing in her seemingly delicate hands as she slashed downward with all her might. She tore into the ground beneath her feet, hooking her blade into the soil, and using it as an anchor to shoot forward. She leapt through the air, landing 3 meters ahead before swinging her axe downward once more and repeating. Her momentum was relentless, her mind blank of all thoughts but the image of the pillars before her. Under the stunned gazes of all those that could witness it, she crossed the final line, her long black hair whipping about beneath a furious aura. The whites of her eyes rolled forth as she roared into the skies, the carvings of the pillars suddenly beginning to glow. Chapter 604. Aina's roar caused a shockwave to tear a path across the mountain pass. For a moment, the illusion of a woman much taller than her seemed to envelop her small figure. However, this lasted for but a moment before a strong surge of force fell from the glowing pillars, enveloping her body in a rain of light. Lionel snapped out of his thoughts, the strength of his fingers digging into his forearm growing to the point he nearly drew blood. He had no idea what was happening, And if it wasn't for the fact he wasn't sure what he'd do even if he stormed his way up, there was no way that he'd be able to sit idle for so long. The elders standing amidst the pillars suddenly all sported frozen expressions. Whatever shocked looks they had just had seemed to be ramped up several-fold. The four geniuses who had been surpassed by Aina suddenly found that continuing forward had become impossible. One after another, they fell to their knees, a look of abject horror on their face. Even Inkith, a man who didn't seem to understand anything that could be solved without brawn, felt his heart trembling. However, though these geniuses fell, each and every one of them kept their eyes level. It was as though each was holding on to the last bit of their pride, unable to allow themselves to fall to the point of not even daring to look. Aina's body had completely disappeared within the lights. The pulsing of the twin pillars grew more heated, reaching a level where even the elders could no longer think of holding back the pressure themselves. Unable to hold back his thoughts any longer, Lionel flipped a palm, causing a familiar silver disc to appear in his hand. Valiant Heart Mountain was a place maybe more fanciful than even Lionel expected. Beyond the mountain range, there sat an all-new world, the kind the people of Earth could have maybe only dreamed about. Valiant Heart Mountain was split into 7 peaks, each of which seemed to thrum with a heartbeat of its own. These peaks were all surrounded by floating islands. But, compared to the paradise islands of Earth, these islands exuded an air of oneness with nature rather than capitalistic greed. They had lush greenery viewable even from the ground below, a land that shone a faint sheen of gold, and hovered in place without the slightest hint of technology. But, what was maybe the most awe-inspiring were the waterfalls that fell from their edges. These waterfalls fell in steady streams, sparkling with and refracting the light of a high violet-colored sun that hung in the air. This refraction gave the water a gorgeous purple hue that played on the fantasies of all. But this wasn't all. These waters fell from the skies and into long, rushing rivers along the peaks they orbited. The seamless transition between the waterfalls in the clouds to the rivers running along the earth made everything look as though it was crafted by the hands of a mighty deity. Still, as beautiful as this scenery might be, those that were here had long since gotten used to it. The hustle and bustle of Valiant Heart Mountain didn't seem to stop even in the face of such sights. But, maybe, this was the human condition. Even in higher dimensional worlds, ignoring the miracles of nature seemed to be ingrained into our very souls. At that moment, though among one of the peaks of Valiant Heart Mountain, all things seemed to have come to a stop. As with many other powers, Valiant Heart Mountain was divided into several factions. But this particular peak, known as Founding Peak, was a location not of a particular one of these factions, but rather the gathering place of the most powerful members of Valiant Heart. In recent days, this location had been rife with debates, each speaking over the other about the direction the organization should go in. But at this moment, they had suddenly fallen into an eerie silence. In fact, not a single soul seemed to be speaking. They all stopped what they were doing, simultaneously looking in a singular direction. At the base of this mountain, there was a section reserved for the future leaders of Valiant Heart Mountain. In truth, they only spent time here as a symbol of their superiority, and used it to organize members of their faction. If this location was to be strictly compared to their normal training locations, it was severely lacking. The base of Founding Peak simply couldn't compare to the peaks of the other 6 peaks, despite the fact the peak of Founding Peak was unmatched. Someone activated the Founding Pillars? It was unknown who spoke these words, nor did it particularly matter. All these youths who had gained the right to set up camp at the base of Founding Mountain were all preparing to accept the new influx of talents into their factions at this exact moment. However, not one had ever expected this particular outcome. Though these youths were separated by several hundred meters, even kilometers in some cases, not a single one hesitated. Without regard for the rules, or even the overseeing elders, they all sent their most trusted subordinate out. They all only had a singular goal: to recruit. At the peak of Founding Peak, there was a single core group that stood above all the rest. It was a group of 3 men and 3 women, each that had been in silent meditation all to their own. At the core of this group, though, there was one more man. It was this man who sat upon the tallest floating island, not moving even while thick white clouds passed through him, causing fine sprits of water droplets to drizzle across his bronzed skin. He opened his eyes somewhat lazily, staring into the distance as though he could peer through the mountains and the thick forest to gaze upon the pillars directly. When the man saw what was happening, his apathetic expression became one of pleasant surprise. The reason he hadn't cared initially was because he was certain that the one to activate the pillars would have been that child he had been warned about all those months ago. But seeing as it wasn't him, a pleasant surprise indeed. It was only after the lights began to dim that Lionel breathed a sigh of relief. At the very least, it didn't seem as though there was anything seriously wrong with Aina. At least, not initially. The moment Lionel thought Aina would be fine, she fell to the ground on all fours, unable to hold on to her battle axe anymore. A violent fit of coughing took hold of her. Lionel's gaze sharpened. He immediately understood that something had aggravated Aina's curse again. He could even see the mask he had crafted her begin to bulge as her scars became more aggravated. But just when things seemed as though they would get out of hand, Aina's mask began to glow. A strong pulse of cool cleansing waters was sprayed over her face again and again. Aina gripped at the earth with her fingers, leaving small trails as she balled her hands into fists. Soon, the pain she was racked by slowly ebbed, her ragged breathing becoming more even. Lionel took a deep breath. He could only be relieved that the contingency plans he had left in place worked. Lionel's gaze suddenly shifted from Aina's back to the distance. Beyond the pillars, several auras converging at speeds he couldn't hope to keep up with under normal circumstances were coming. Lionel felt that there were some of them that were even more powerful than the elders who had come to preside over this entrance ceremony, a fact that gave him no small measure of pause. It didn't take much thought for Lionel to connect their appearance with the commotion Aina had caused. Just as Aina was picking herself up, the 6 auras had already come into range. The elder who had led this event from the beginning looked back and frowned. "You all aren't allowed to be here." "Hee, Elder Tobies, there's no need to be so uptight." The young man who spoke was almost 8 feet tall. He was easily the tallest individual Lionel had ever laid eyes on. His posture was terrible, his back arching forward to the point he appeared to be a foot shorter than he truly was. But his exposed torso was filled with an unprecedented amount of power. Lionel thought that he was in good shape, as he had been all his life, but this man had muscles bulging out of places he never thought possible. His limbs were long and lanky, his legs almost taking up a third of his body and his reaching past his knees, though that was likely in part due to the fact his posture was so terrible. Elder Tobies glared at the youth and the few that had come with him. He knew exactly who these youths were. In any other situation he would be grinning ear to ear that his valiant Heart Mountain had such talent. But here, they were clearly stepping over a line. Hephaestus. Unfortunately, before Tobies could reprimand the young man any more, Hephaestus had already turned his attention to Aina, who had long since picked herself up. "Oh, a little girly. Hey, little chick, what do you say to joining my hero peak? Important announcement below, be sure to read it." Chapter 605. Aina stood somewhat weakly. Her body had hardly gained its bearings when she was suddenly asked this question. She sent a look toward Hephaestus, her gaze placid. The truth was that Aina had heard about Valiant Heart Mountain from Yuri. As a result, she had a small understanding of it. If not for this, why else would she prepare a ticket to Terrain to come here? That said, it could also be said that Aina had no choice but to choose this place. Valiant Heart Mountain was the overlord of this quadrant and several other quadrants. Only the most well-established worlds with the strongest foundations could afford to send their youths to other organizations outside of their jurisdiction. For Earth, a place where even a ticket to a world considered to be relatively close by, like Terrain, cost a Tier 9 black-grade treasure. It was obviously an impossible dream to think of traveling so far. With their foundation, Aina didn't even want to think about what it would cost to go to a place other than Valiant Heart Mountain. This was all to say that Aina had heard of Hero Peak before. In fact, she had heard of all 7 peaks of Valiant Heart. Founding Peak, Hero Peak, Brave Peak, Justice Peak, Honor Peak, Loyal Peak, Respect Peak. One wouldn't be surprised to find out, then, that the Brave City Lionel and Aina took their trial in was constructed by Brave Peak. Other various peaks would have their own testing means. That said, just because they were tested by Brave City, didn't mean that they couldn't choose to join another peak. The various city establishments were just a way of parsing the burden of recruitment. In the end, Valiant Heart Mountain was still a singular entity. The youths who had come with Hephaestus immediately wanted to say something to cut him off. How could they just allow him to say and do as he pleased? They didn't want to make their trip a worthless one. But before they could, Aina spoke. "Are you the strongest?" It was a simple sentence. Spoken in 4 words, it seemed to speak 1,000. There was no other question Aina wanted answered. No other that was more important to her. This and this alone was all that mattered. Hephaestus was stunned by the question for a moment, before he began to laugh uproariously. "You hear that, you bastards? This little girlie will be joining Hero Peak. You weaklings can all take a step back." The expressions of the others' youths soured immediately, but they said nothing to refute. There was no doubting Hero Peak's strength. In the last 20 years, there had been no singular peak able to supplant their rule. Hephaestus turned his attention back to Aina. Though his posture was terrible, his body exuded a bestial strength that made his bones pop and crackle with his every movement. "Not only is Hero Peak the strongest, we have been the strongest for the last quarter century. We have the strongest warriors, the best facilities and the most resources. On top of that, our leader, the hero Raylion, is the strongest of the 6 leaders. If even that isn't enough for you, even me, as a mere little vice leader, could wipe the floor with some of these other so-called leaders." Hephaestus grinned from ear to ear, towering over the petite Aina. "There's no better choice than us." Aina looked up at Hephaestus, her gaze somewhat distant and emotionless. She didn't seem moved by his display. Hephaestus felt smaller in comparison to the puppet master. But with her poor senses, Aina couldn't tell whether this was an illusion or not. "Okay," Aina said plainly. Hephaestus scanned Aina up and down, sending a curious look toward her mask. But he seemed even more shocked by her demeanor. Even that old fogey Tobies wouldn't feel so comfortable before him. "You heard her, old man." Hephaestus turned toward Elder Tobies. "She made her own decision. You saw that I didn't force her, right?" Hephaestus' toothy grin made it hard for Tobies to refrain from rolling his eyes. The reason these brats weren't supposed to be allowed to interfere at this juncture was because it was too easy for them to influence the decisions of these youths by underhanded means. And even in the case that didn't happen, there was precedent for fights breaking out during recruitment. As such, it was usual policy to allow the youths a few days to soak in the atmosphere of Valiant Heart for themselves, and then choose a peak that was right for them. In such a situation, the youths would have to pass an exam of sorts, far different from Aina, who seemed capable of joining without such a thing. But it was thanks to these rules that a relative peace was able to be kept in what would have otherwise been a violent few weeks. Since Aina had made her own decision and didn't seem to be pressured in any way, though, there was no reason for him to interfere. From what he could see, whether he stopped her here or not, Aina would end up joining Hero Peak regardless. Though there were many rules in Valiant Heart, there was one ultimate rule that ruled all others: strength. Since Hephaestus and Aina had the capital, they could do as they pleased. At that moment, Aina looked back to meet Lionel's gaze. But all she found was a young man grinning with 2 thumbs up by the sides of his cheeks. He looked so happy, almost as though it was his own achievement rather than hers. Aina couldn't help but think that he looked quite goofy, a sight that made her sputter with laughter. Hephaestus and Elder Tobies were taken off guard by the sudden change in the valiant young lady. They didn't even know a person with such a demeanor could laugh in such a way. Hephaestus raised an eyebrow as he looked toward where Aina was looking. In the end, he chose to not bother with the exchange as he swept a glance over the 4 geniuses kneeling along the mountain pass. Hero Peak has no need for losers. This will be our only recruit during this recruitment cycle. Hephaestus' disposition completely changed. It felt as though the mountain above had fused with him, his lofty air looking down with an undying arrogance. Chapter 606. Hearing these words, Aina frowned. She had expected Hero Peak to be relatively exclusive, but she hadn't worried about it. With Lionel's talent, Was there really anything exclusive enough to keep him out? If there was a test, there would be no issue. But from what Hephaestus said, there would no longer be a recruitment test. In truth, Hephaestus' actions weren't exactly wrong. Over the past few years, having even one person pass Hero Peak's exam was already a blessing. He was already content with having found Aina, so he didn't feel that there was even a need to waste resources testing anymore. Every exam took up a sum of wealth from Hero Peak, and there were no shortage of people who would come despite knowing they had no chance of passing. This would result in Hero Peak's expenses being far greater than they would otherwise be. Usually, this could be solved with a simple screening process, but this took resources to build up as well. This was especially so since Hero Peak emphasized not base power, but rather potential. This was exactly why a comprehensive exam was more appropriate than having a screening process. But now that Hephaestus had found a recruit, and especially with the precarious situation Valiant Heart was in currently, why waste these resources? It would be much easier to reach their goals if they saved as much as they could and reinvested it into the talents that actually mattered. Even if Aina could guess much of these things, though, she didn't want to leave Lionel behind. At least for now, she didn't feel like making such a decision was necessary. She had yet to reach such a crossroads. And, even if this wasn't about her feelings, and she could shed them all away to think about this as logically as possible, the resources Lionel had access to were likely impossible to find in Valiant Heart. Just his cleansing waters alone, which could keep her curse under control, was a rarity impossible to explain. Every time she tried to tell Lionel just how valuable cleansing waters were, he would point to the toilet bowl in his abode setting. It was mildly infuriating. Of course, Aina didn't think of Lionel in terms of the resources he could provide. She had gotten used to being by his side over the past near year. She didn't want to leave him so soon even if they would technically be in the same place. "Can't you hold one more test?" Aina suddenly asked. Hephaestus frowned when he heard these words. Instead of his gaze shifting to lock onto Aina, it instead swept over her briefly before locking onto Lionel in the distance. He had ignored Lionel previously for obvious reasons. If he looked down on a young man and woman like Inkith and Irolana who had made it more than 80% of the way up, why would he even deem to speak to someone who didn't even start? This young lady might have been talented, but she didn't understand the weight of an expert's words. Since he had already said that they wouldn't be accepting anyone else, wouldn't he be a joke if he suddenly took those words back not even a few seconds after he had stated them? "Listen, little chick. You might be a bit talented, but it seems you haven't understood something. Now that you've joined Hero Peak, you are at the bottom of the totem pole. Even the servants that sweep the floors are above you. What makes you think you can ask something like this of me?" From start to finish, Hephaestus didn't look at Aina. Rather, he had his eyes locked onto Lionel as though he was giving a silent warning. Aina's brows furrowed. She most definitely didn't like being spoken to like that. She couldn't be considered to have a temper, nor was she as prideful as Lionel. But that didn't mean everyone didn't have their own bottom line. He could have walked up the mountain pass just like I did. It's just that our world was in the middle of a war, and he got heavily injured during it. His body isn't in any condition to withstand such pressure. Hephaestus' aura sharpened. This little girl actually still dared to talk back to him? A man who backs away from a challenge just because he's a little hurt? You think that this is enough of an excuse? Hero Peak has no need for such weak-willed trash. Hephaestus' gaze swept back toward Aina. Since you don't seem to know your place, that's fine too. From now on, even if your little boyfriend recovers and has some strength, he won't be allowed to join my Hero Peak. It seemed that this little girl didn't understand the meaning of hierarchy. Just because he was here to personally recruit her, didn't mean that her standing was suddenly the equivalent of his. In addition, according to the rules of Valiant Heart, the transfer from one peak to another was considered an internal dispute. The unsaid truth was that now that Hero Peak had laid claim to Aina, there was no other peak that would dare take her now lest they want to become more acquainted with what internal dispute might mean in this context. Aina's gaze flashed with fury when she heard these words. Seeing the situation going south, Lionel began to walk up the mountain pass. Unfortunately, since the pillars had recently given a large blessing to Aina, it would take some weeks before they could recover to their original strength. At the moment, walking up the mountain pass was only slightly more difficult than walking anywhere else within this fifth-dimensional world. It was akin to a 5% boost to gravity. It wasn't long before Aina felt a hand on her shoulder, stopping her from gripping at her axe, which was nailed into the ground beside her. Lionel smiled. It's not a big deal. As long as this vice leader doesn't use underhanded tricks to make your stay at Hero Peak more difficult than it needs to be, it's the best place for you. Hephaestus almost laughed at these words. How many brats were going to challenge him today? Did they want to die? Bulging veins suddenly popped across Hephaestus' right hand. It seemed like, with a thought, had pierced Lionel's heart through completely. But at that moment he felt Elder Toby's aura lock onto him, causing him to slowly calm himself. Hephaestus sneered. Everything on Hero Peak is earned through merit. Good, Lionel said plainly. Somehow, this answer only infuriated Hephaestus more. Lou. Lionel shook his head, cutting Aina off and taking out 10 golden tags. Take them. Chapter 607. You. Aina didn't know how to respond. Keep half of them. Lionel shook his head. I don't really need anything from their vaults, honestly. There's nothing they can provide that I can't build. Especially considering the best weapon the vice leader of the strongest peak has is only tier 7 black. If you don't find anything you want, just trade the tags in for some ores you like and it'll build something better. Aina was speechless when she heard Lionel say these words. In truth, the Lionel she knew very rarely got angry. Even when she teased him to oblivion, he only retaliated in the most benign of ways. The only time she had ever seen him truly enraged was with the puppet master and the Reynard, Pisces situation. But those things, in her opinion, were warranted. This was all to say that Aina didn't know that Lionel could actually be so petty. Hearing his words, even Elder Toby's couldn't help but frown despite the fact he had practically just saved Lionel's life. Did someone kick this kid in the head? A tier 7 black grade treasure was about the best one could expect a fourth-dimensional entity to wield. Only fifth-dimensional existences might begin to wield tier 8 and 9 black grade treasures. At least this was the case in this part of the universe. Only sixth-dimensional worlds had a large number of bronze grade treasures. Likewise, only seventh-dimensional worlds had a large number of silver grade treasures. No matter how you sliced it, it looked as though Lionel was making an immature comment about something he hardly understood. The words alone made whatever impact gathering 10 golden tags might have fall flat. Of those here, maybe it was only Aina who understood how truthful Lionel was being. Let alone a tier 7 black grade treasure. Lionel could already begin constructing tier 1 bronze grade treasures, each of which would be exponentially more powerful than even a quasi-bronze grade treasure, of which he had no small number of. Lionel simply didn't care about what Hephaestus or Elder Toby's thought of him because he never cared to join this organization in the first place. If Lionel had to pick out one reason he didn't try to convince Aina of taking a different path, it would have to be because of the segmented cube. This was the first time Lionel had stepped foot into a fourth-dimensional world, so this was also the first time the segmented cube could begin to absorb fifth-dimensional force. Albeit slowly, the segmented cube was working its way toward entering Phase 3. Once it did so, Lionel would be able to heal Aina. Lionel slid the tags into Aina's hand. Oh, also. Lionel suddenly thought of something. Take this with you too. The tags were sucked into the jigsaw-like cube. Soon, all that was left on Aina's palm was the segmented cube itself. All right, off you go. Seeing that Aina didn't seem apt to leave, Lionel laughed. He leaned into her ear and spoke softly. Even if the others tried, they wouldn't be able to hear what he was saying. But that didn't stop Aina's neck from flushing red. Do you think that there's any barrier in this place that can stop me? The words were simple, no more complex than Aina's question for Hephaestus. But they reverberated with Aina deeply. Okay. Aina said lightly, taking the cube. Hephaestus didn't say anything. He simply turned and walked away. What only he and Lionel seemed to be aware of was the fact there was a strong killing intent locked onto the latter from start to finish. Yet Lionel had hardly reacted. The cause of this matter was clear. This wasn't about how strong Lionel was or wasn't. It was simply about a man deeming his word as more important than the word of any other. Hephaestus didn't care what reasoning Lionel had. Since he had spoken his word, he wouldn't take it back. This was exactly the same reason why he hadn't booted Aina out from Hero Peak. Lionel smiled and waved as Aina disappeared into the distance. It was only after she was gone that his gaze became cold, and the atmosphere seemed to become frozen. When did I become so murderous? Lionel thought to himself. If it wasn't for the sake of Aina, he really might have killed Hephaestus just then. Lionel felt as though his inhibitions against killing were loosening each and every day. Would there really come a time where he reaped lives like cutting weeds? He didn't really like the feeling. If he killed Hephaestus, what then? Wouldn't he be cutting off Aina's path? And where would he find another fifth-dimensional world to station himself in? Lionel had learned a lot about the dimensional verse in recent times. More than enough to understand that traveling up a dimension was no simple task. At the very least, with Earth's current infrastructure, the price would likely near a silver-grade treasure. This was obviously something Lionel couldn't afford. If he was forced to leave this place too soon, he didn't know when he'd be able to cure Aina. Brat, you're too impulsive. Lionel, who was lost in his own thoughts as though there weren't others around him, was suddenly startled awake. Lionel raised an eyebrow. He was impulsive? If the old man knew what was going on in his mind, had realized just how much prudence Lionel had shown just now. Whether or not Lionel could actually defeat Hephaestus was unknown even to him. But what Lionel was sure of was that Hephaestus would suffer greatly if he had to battle him. Elder Toby shook his head and looked back toward the other faction vice leaders. But it was clear that of them were very interested in the youths that remained. If they wanted to join, they could take the exam like everyone else. And while they would allow this for the four geniuses to Lionel's back, it was unlikely that they'd make room for Lionel himself after what they just saw. Youths should learn to bide their time. What good does your killing intent do you now? Lionel raised an eyebrow at these words. But he didn't say much as he made his way up the mountain pass. His killing intent? Hephaestus should be happy that he restrained it. Chapter 608. Hey. Wait up. Lionel looked back with a partially confused look, only to find a lanky and pale man following after him. This was other than Radleys. As for why he had quit chasing after Balthorn for the sake of catching up to Lionel, maybe only he knew the answer to that. Yes. No need to be so glum. I know your girlfriend just got snatched, but there are plenty of women in the sea. Lionel's lip curled. She didn't get snatched. Mmhm. Radleys caught up, slowing down to walk beside Lionel. They say denial is the first form of acceptance. Just don't stay bogged down in it for too long. It's alright, with your looks and my humor, we have the chance to be the lady killers of the freshman class. Just look at that sexy lady over there. Radleys hooked his chin over his shoulder, sending lewd looks toward Balthorn. She's already infatuated with you, just forget about that girl. Lionel shook his head. How was he even supposed to respond to this exactly? Inkith, Irolana and Balthorn lagged behind. Since they couldn't join any factions, they had no choice but to wait a few days until the exams were opened up. Only then would they be able to pick a join. The atmosphere around them was clearly much less enthusiastic than Radley's. In fact, they were quite downcast. Who would feel great after being looked down upon in that fashion? They had all come here with great aspirations, only to feel as though it had been dashed. By now, it was clear to them that they'd just be playing background for Aina in the future. Such a reality left them feeling down. The one with especially complex feelings about this was Balthorn. Especially after the words she had spoken about Aina. Who cared what Aina looked like if she had strength? In fact, in this world, all beauty got you was constant harassment, and the right to be used as a pawn by your family. Not only did Aina had strength, but she was also never have to worry about such a thing. It felt like Balthorn was still scorning Aina for her scars at the moment, but the truth was that she was jealous. Jealous she didn't have such strength, jealous that she didn't have such freedom. It seems you still don't get it. You're a little slow, so let this more intelligent brother of yours explain. Radlys wrapped an arm around Lionel's shoulders, standing to the tip of his toes. Lionel raised another eyebrow. "I'm slow." Radlys coughed lightly. "How do I put this delicately? Well, anyone who thinks Tier 7 treasures can drop like pies from the skies is definitely a little bit slow. Anyway." The truth was that everyone assumed that Lionel must have made a massive mistake. Maybe his world had a different ranking system for weapons. This wasn't rare in primitive worlds who had only just evolved. So it was possible that Tier 7 in Lionel's mind was maybe a Tier 3 or 4 weapon. In fact, in some cases, there were worlds so misinformed that they gave third-dimensional weapons the ranking system for fourth-dimensional black-grade weapons. Radlys believed that Lionel was likely from a latter world. Or else it was impossible that he would say such a thing about a Tier 7 treasure. That was the only possible justification. Anyone who could treat real Tier 7 black treasures in such a way wouldn't even bother to come to a place like this. They'd be from a sixth-dimensional world, or at the very least, a world close to it. Radlys continued on quickly as though not wanting Lionel to respond. He definitely had an odd way of trying to spare feelings. "Listen, man, you can't trust women too much. They're vindictive little demonesses. Your girlfriend likes you now, but when she sees all those tall, handsome men from Hero Peak, all of which will be stronger than you, by the way, well, it's in their nature to be swayed." Lionel was speechless. Why did he feel like he was talking to James again? Lionel sighed when he thought of that name for the first time in a long while. He hadn't really spent a lot of time at Royal Blue Fort during the war, so he had only had an idea of who was on the battlefield. Thanks to that, he knew that his teammates were fine. But James hadn't been on the battlefield, so he had no idea where he was. Though Lionel had promised his coach to James another chance. Truthfully, he didn't know if he wanted to. I know what you're thinking. Your girlfriend isn't exactly. Let me not speak on another man's affections. But you should know that there are no shortage of powerful and handsome men from Hero Peak who also happen to be very rich. They can probably afford certain treatments that you cannot. Hearing Radley's endless rambling, Lionel was at a complete loss. Not speak on another man's affections? What exactly had he been doing, then, for the last 10 minutes? He had talked so much that they managed to reach the top of the mountain, only to cross a curtain of force and be greeted by an entirely new world. Lionel took it all in with a single glance. If he was in the mood, he might have been quite impressed by what he was seeing. But at the moment, it could be said that if it wasn't for his usually easygoing personality, he would have kicked even Radley's far away by now. "Listen, man, I'll be fine. There are plenty of fish in the sea." Lionel tuned Radley's out. Was he worried about Aina? Not even a little bit. He didn't have to put up a false sense of bravado about it either. All he knew was that if it took even him 5 years and the world almost ending in order to get her to open up to him, well, he could only say good luck to those who deemed to try. That said, after their attempts failed, he wouldn't mind teaching them their place. Not long after the group crossed into Valiant Heart Mountain and took in the city around them, they were met by another group who seemed to have been waiting especially for them. That should be him. The one with the long goldish bronze hair. As soon as one of them confirmed, the group of 5 all converged at once. Their target? Lionel without a doubt. Chapter 609. Hephaestus continued on in a good mood, leading Aina toward Hero Peak. Aina suddenly looked back, as though she could sense that something was wrong, but she continued to move forward as though nothing had happened. Hephaestus seemed to sense this small action, causing his lip to curl. But it was then that Aina said something that made his eyes narrow. "Next time, send stronger lackeys," she said, seemingly to no one. "Ho ho, didn't you say your little boyfriend was injured? But now I should be worried?" In truth, with how arrogant Hephaestus was, something like sending lackeys to deal with a junior was beneath him. However, what was even more beneath him was personally taking action. So he chose the path that would best soothe his currently seething rage. If not for getting caught red-handed, he would have never even bothered to respond to Aina at all, especially considering the entire reason this began was due to his authority being questioned. He could be 10 times more injured, and you would have still needed to send someone stronger. Aina replied blandly. At the moment, Aina was feeling quite guilty. She knew Lionel well. If it wasn't for her telling him to stay put because he was injured, he wouldn't have even cared about his boat estate in order to climb the mountain pass. This wasn't because he felt the need to prove something to Valiant Heart, an organization he put not stock in, but rather because that was just the kind of person that he was. But now there was already no taking the things that happened back. Hearing such words, Hephaestus suddenly began to laugh uproariously. They say love is blind, but this must be a worse case of foolish love. That's fine though. I'd really like to see how long you can continue to love a weakling after I'm done with him. Since you want to be smart, I'll make certain he can never raise his head high in my Valiant Heart mountain. There was no doubt that Hephaestus was repeating the same words Radlys had spoken, but not as blatantly. And it was even more obvious that Aina's words had once more provoked Hephaestus. That said, this time, Aina didn't seem to react with the same guilt at all. Rather, her face, hidden beneath her mask, had gone back to being expressionless. Go ahead and vent, she thought to herself. Yip, yip. The little mink jumped out from the segmented cube and into Aina's arms, baring his little fangs at Hephaestus. It was only after Aina soothed him that he finally began to calm down. Lionel stood in opposition to a group of 3, his eyes lazily scanning them. It was obvious by their words that he was their target, and toward such a thing, he could only say that the vice leader of Hero Peak was maybe even more petty than himself. This Hephaestus didn't even wait an hour, let alone the few days someone else might have, before sending his goons after him. But Lionel truly didn't mind. In fact, behind his apathetic expression, he was holding back a grin that could have gone from one ear to the other. I don't know how fresh meat like you managed to offend the bigwigs, but how do you plan on settling this? The leader of this gang of 3 seemed almost too lazy to deal with Lionel. He held no personal animosity toward Lionel, and he even felt that dealing with a freshman was far beneath him. It wasn't until one entered Valiant Heart that they truly understood the distance that separated those who had joined quadrant-ruling organizations, and those from small worlds who could at best call a corner of a quadrant their home. Just in terms of taxes collected, Valiant Heart had a number of resources that could drown out any world in their wealth alone. With these resources came millennia of foundation building, an endless store of knowledge and techniques beyond anything someone from a smaller world could possibly understand. If Valiant Heart Mountain were to be ranked using the official metrics of the dimensional verse, as an organization overseeing number quadrants, they were a bronze-grade organization at worst. If Earth was put on this same scale, they wouldn't even qualify to be known as black grade. Are you from Hero Peak? Don't. Balthorn tried to speak out before Lionel could finish his sentence, but it was already too late. She took a sharp intake of breath before looking at Lionel's side profile. Is he really that slow? Even if he got beat up to the point of having half a foot in the coffin, that's the one question he should have never asked. As expected, the moment the leader of lackeys heard this, he froze for a moment before a sinister smile crept onto his face. You have a lot of guts, calling out Hero Peak's name in vain like that. Do you think the likes of Hero Peak has the time to deal with bottom feeders like you? You seem quite offended for someone who isn't from Hero Peak. Lionel replied evenly. The lackey's jaw clenched, the murderous intent in his gaze deepening. If others really found out that Hero Peak was stooping to such lows, it would be a blight on their prestige. Though the words were unspoken, the burden for such a rumor spreading would definitely be on his head. Not only was this Lionel a fool enough to offend Hephaestus before even stepping into Valiant Heart, but he was even trying to drag him down with him. If Lionel insisted on this narrative, this small scuffle that would have likely ended after a small beating would grow to the point of the entire peak pitting themselves against him. Ahaha, hey buddy pal. Radlys patted Lionel's shoulder. It's been nice knowing you. I think I see a beauty over there. Radlys dashed away, hiding into the accumulating crowd. Inkith, Irelana and Balthorn frowned, but they too didn't want anything to do with this situation. Though there was no chance in joining Hero Peak now, there were no shortage of individuals who had defected from their own peaks to join them later. Still not saying anything? Lionel continued as though he didn't notice these youths distancing themselves from him. He hardly knew them, so why would he care? Wheeler, we need to shut him up. One of the three called out to the leading lackey. They couldn't allow Lionel to say anything more. Agreed. Wheeler nodded. We'll see if he still has the cheek to say such things after we're done with him. As though by tacit agreement, the two behind Wheeler shot forward. Chapter 6:10. Lionel's gaze flashed, sliding into a boxing stance with incomparable ease. He became as light as a feather on his toes, his breathing syncing with his actions. His bronzed hair fluttered with his movement, rebounding into the air as he hopped to and fro. The instant it fell back down to his back, he shot forward, his speed blazing. Despite the fact that he was pincered by two, Lionel protected the side of his face with his right, and sent a straight left forward. A whipping kick shot for Lionel's right hip, even as the young man on the left seemed content with simply blocking his straight. From the perspective of the lackeys, this would be over quickly. Just one of them was more than enough to deal with a freshman. The only reason they had even chosen to send two was due to the accumulating crowd. Lionel had shown that he wasn't intelligent enough to not speak what shouldn't be spoken. So when dealing with such people who didn't understand fear, the best course of action was teaching them exactly that. Bang! The kick was fast and sturdy. Without wasted movements, it perfectly made use of the young man's torque. Even his planted leg tore a rotating hole into the ground, a sharp wind following the trail of his assault. However, when his leg actually came into contact with Lionel's right arm, it felt as though he had just kicked at a steel wall. Lionel winced slightly, feeling his fractured ribs rattling upon impact. But his straight left never stopped. With perfect form, his fist blew past the guard of the young man's forearms, connecting with his nose with a speed too fast to react to. Lionel could feel a satisfying crunch beneath his knuckles, a bloody spray launching into the air. What was a face of soft and fragile skin, and bone worth in the face of Lionel's fist which might as well have been a steel brick? The instant Lionel connected, he turned his attention toward the kicker, his hips shifting. His speed was so fast that he had already closed the distance between them before his leg even lowered. Unbalanced and unable to protect himself, the young man could only watch as Lionel retracted his left hand and landed a right hook right into his rib cage. It felt as though all the air within his body was expelled at once. An audible snapping noise sounded, followed by a muffled cry. With muted thuds, two seniors fell at once, one clutching their chest and the other their face. As though completely unsatisfied, Lionel had already shot by them, not minding their reaction in the slightest. While they looked down on him, in his mind, one punch was already more than they deserved in the first place. Lionel closed the distance between him and Wheeler. Though shocked, the latter reacted quickly, his expression turning solemn. Lionel shot a fist forward, only for it to be met by Wheeler's. Having learned his lesson, Wheeler coded his own in as much force as he could muster, bearing down on Lionel with absolute strength and power. Lionel reacted calmly. His mind drifted to the times he had utilized the incomplete Four Seasons realm for his fists. He imagined the way the force had flowed around him, the way it melded with his attacks with perfection, without him even thinking about it. His force matched the flow in his mind, his simulation so perfect that one would almost think that he had begun to use universal force if it wasn't for the fact it was very clearly just of the third dimension. Bang! Both Lionel and Wheeler took a single step back. But whereas the latter was stunned, Lionel had already shot forward, closing the distance once more. In the blink of an eye, the two exchanged a flurry of blows, Wheeler using whatever means he had while Lionel used nothing but his fists. Lionel's movements were sharp and focused. If he only had to throw a single punch to neutralize a combination, he would do so. It almost felt that everyone was watching a combat puppet battle. His style was that immaculate. However, while Lionel was growing more and more focused, Wheeler felt as though his arms and legs might just shatter at any moment. Fighting Lionel may have looked like fighting a combat puppet to the people outside, but to him, it felt exactly like that. It was as though Lionel's limbs were made and formed of the universe's most precious materials. Wheeler roared. The longer this fight went on, the more people who would accumulate, and the more humiliated he would be. The truth was that hardly anyone knew his face. He was nothing more than a glorified janitor of Hero Peak. Hephaestus wasn't exaggerating when he said that Aina's standing was now below even the floor sweepers. However, if this blew up too much, the more resourceful youths would definitely find a way to connect this back to Hero Peak. Spikes began to grow off Wheeler's arms, enlarging to the point they arched over his fists and protected his knuckles. A strong corrosive energy hung in the air, bearing down on Lionel. To Wheeler, it didn't matter how strong Lionel's defenses were. Before his corrosive force, it was all meaningless. However, what Wheeler didn't expect was that Lionel hadn't gone all out either. The instant it seemed as though Wheeler didn't want to be humiliated any longer, illusory golden wings seemed to appear to Lionel's back for just a split moment. It was so brief that the vast majority of the crowd didn't even notice. With a flick of his palm, a spear appeared. It was bland, even having a wooden pole. If it wasn't for the feathers strapped to its polearm, it wouldn't have any character whatsoever. This was other than the primitive woman's spear. Wheeler went stiff as he suddenly felt something sharp pierce through his leg. After a moment of lag, he roared out in pain, stumbling and falling to his knees. Lionel's piercing motion was too fast, too swift. Before anyone could react, all four of Wheeler's limbs were rendered useless. He stood amidst three collapsed seniors, his visage expressionless. Chapter 6:11. Lionel whipped out his spear, his wrist flexing. The droplets of blood that remained sprayed outward, leaving the spear spotless and whether by design or accident, landing on the three moaning and groaning before him. Inkith, Irolana and Balthorn didn't quite know how to react to such a scene. They had been planning on distancing themselves, but Lionel had reacted so quickly that they were somehow still to his back. Their vantage point was by far the best of everyone else. But it was precisely because of this that they could hardly believe what they had just seen. Wheeler and the other so-called seniors were all tier 4 at worst. This number sounded benign. After all, even the city lords of Terrain had been more powerful than this. Their average strength had been around tier 6 while the most powerful of them like City Lord White had been tier 7. However, it had to be understood that strength across worlds was looked upon differently. The truth was that true geniuses spent the most time within the fourth dimension, slowly accumulating the strength of their bodies. In the dimensional verse, the third dimension was technically the beginning, but the reality was that it was more like a spark. The fourth dimension was where the flame was slowly nurtured and grown. The fourth dimension would lay the foundation of the body into the future. So, usually, geniuses would wait until their force spilled over into the next realm, rather than forcing their way through like the city lords of Terrain had. As a result, tier 4 to these seniors was likely no worse than tier 6 to those city lords. In comparison, Inkith, Irolana and Balthorn were all still suppressing their force at tier 1. Unfortunately, they couldn't even use this as an excuse because Lionel hadn't even stepped into the fourth dimension yet. Of course, of this mentioned abilities. But Lionel had taken 2 out before they even got a chance to use theirs, while he abused his speed to stop Wheeler from making use of his. It could be said that with this one fight, Lionel was already considered to be the strongest newcomer, and was even a match for upper years. At that moment, before the stunned crowd could even process what they had just seen, Lionel put his spear away and began to move. Pulling out a rope of beast tendons from who knows where, Lionel tied a single ankle of each one of these so-called seniors, and began to drag them. Too caught up in their own pain, the groaning seniors could only protect themselves from worsening their injuries while being dragged through the crowd. Lionel stopped before a thick tree near the city gates. If there was one thing Valiant Heart Mountain had going for it, it was the fact that its city wasn't completely disconnected from nature. Even such a thick tree which would easily take 10 men to wrap around it was still standing here proudly. Lionel took out another spear. This one had an exceptionally long blade that took up a third of its body. In reality, it almost felt and looked more like a glaive than anything else. Still holding onto the rope with one hand, Lionel began to slowly carve into the soil around the tree, careful not to harm its roots. It would be a shame if such a beautiful ancient tree died. No one understood what Lionel was doing. And unfortunately for the trio of seniors at his feet, no one dared to stick their nose in this mess. They were still unaware of exactly what was happening, but what they did know was that a youth of not even the fourth dimension had just demolished 3 Tier 4 experts. From the conversation they had overheard, it was clear that this young man was a freshman, yet he already wielded such strength. In their minds, anyone with such power would most definitely not come from a common background. Yet, this young man had also said something about these lackeys being from Hero Peak, who would want to get caught in the battle between 2 giants. At this point, they could only hope that the boy's background was as exaggerated as they thought it was, or else his life would be pretty much forfeit. Although killing between fellow disciples was prohibited, if one understood the cruelty of the world, there were a lot of things one could do before reaching that extreme. And in a lot of ways, those things were even worse depending on the type of person that you were. Considering how prideful this young man seemed to be, there was likely little doubt that he would likely be a person exactly like that. At that moment, someone gasped. Everyone snapped out of their thoughts at once only to find that Lionel had launched the 3 into the air, hanging them all from the thick tree upside down. Lionel tied the final knots tightly. He wasn't very familiar with the most difficult to undo knots in the past, but one would be surprised just how comprehensive the lesson plans his father left behind were. Lionel doubted that there would be anyone who could undo this knot in Valiant Heart. Their only option would be to cut them down. But if they thought it would be so easy, they'd be sorely mistaken. Taking a step back, Lionel admired his handiwork before nodding to himself in satisfaction. Make way. At that moment, a young woman pushed her way through. Not far behind her, Radley seamlessly blended into the crowd once again, but Lionel didn't miss that small hint. He couldn't help but shake his head. It seemed that Radley's hadn't just run away after all. The crowd began to murmur. They recognized this young woman. This wasn't because she was famous, but rather because of the unique runes drawn across her cloth belt. She was a member of the only true neutral faction of Valiant Heart Mountain, Valiant Hall. They were the peacekeepers of the organization, and handled disputes between disciples. They were also designated with the task of recruiting disciples. And this final role was what Lionel knew this woman the most for. She was other than Sale, the young woman who had recruited both himself and Aina. Chapter 6:12. They say that Hero Peak was the most powerful peak. But the true reason for this was because Valiant Hall never involved themselves in any resource disputes. If not for this, even if Valiant Hall wouldn't be the most powerful, they would definitely be a close second or third to Hero Peak. When Sale made her way through the crowd, something that was not too difficult considering her stature, she suddenly felt a massive headache coming on when she saw that the core of this commotion was Lionel. God damn it. She screamed in her mind. This was exactly what she didn't want to happen. And of the elders of Valiant Heart who were against accepting Lionel, this was exactly what they had worried about as well. If they accepted him into the organization, what would they do when he ran amok? How were they supposed to reprimand the potential heir of a 7th-dimensional family? They could hardly hold on to their place among bronze organizations. They had no right to even think of facing the ire of a gold organization. In the end, their only recourse was in ignoring Lionel while he was here, and hoping that he went away faster. In their minds, a genius like Lionel wouldn't be with them for very long. As long as they held out for a year or two, he would likely get bored of the girl he was chasing, or maybe he would even win her heart. Then he would go off toward other adventures. Of course, they had also considered that this was potentially part of the coming trials all Morales clan heirs had to face. But that world was so far from them that they only understood tidbits that they could pick up from rumors. Though Sale had believed this to be the case, after speaking to more knowledgeable elders, she realized how ridiculous her previous assertions were. They, as a mere 5th-dimension organization, had no chance in stepping foot into such a war. If they did so, they would only be asking for death. This was ultimately why the decision was made. They would ignore Lionel. They wouldn't ask him for help because they were well aware that he had no way of helping them. This decision is what resulted in Lionel's current situation. Aside from Sale, the 2 Valiant Hall members that had come with her that day, and the highest echelon members of Valiant Heart. No one else was aware of Lionel's true identity. And the truth was that other than well-learned individuals like Sale, who also happened to have had the benefit of seeing much of the world, no one would be able to deduce Lionel's identity either. It could even be said that if it wasn't Sale specifically who had gone that day, maybe, even to this point, no one would know Lionel's true identity. After all, there was a reason even to his death. Anared didn't recognize Lionel even after he used his bronze runes. Lionel smiled when he saw Sale. Long time no see. Long time no see your head. Sale grit her teeth. This damned playboy chased a girl all the way here, and he still hasn't given up yet. Now he's causing trouble I've got to clean up. How are we supposed to keep the prestige of Valiant Hall if we're lenient with him? Come with me. Sale eventually said coldly. Lionel raised an eyebrow. What for? Sale felt like her head was about to explode. This damned brat, couldn't he understand that she was trying to be lenient? Though Lionel hadn't killed anyone, battling disciples outside of designated areas was also grounds for punishment. Within the crowd, Radley scratched his head at a loss. He had gotten a Valiant Hall member to help Lionel. But who knew that he would actually beat those 3 seniors before he could even get her here? It seemed that his help was more of a detriment than anything else. Radley sighed. Pops always said to keep your nose out of everyone's business. If those who knew Radley's heard him say this, they'd probably bash him over the head. Maybe he should listen to his father more. But it was clear that he had never taken these words very seriously. What Sale didn't know, though, was that Lionel really didn't know. From his perspective, he wasn't in the wrong considering he was attacked first. But now, Sale hadn't even asked what happened before asking him to come with her. He was attacked first. Yeah, those greasy seniors tried to put paws on our handsome little junior brother. They deserve to be hung up a tree. Yeah. Radley dashed through the crowd, cupping his hand over his mouth and forming different voices. He was seemingly exceptionally proud of his female voice. Little junior brother, if she bullies you can come to me tonight. Big sis with soothe your aching limbs. The crowd seemed to grow more and more rowdy. Sale frowned when she heard these things. You were attacked first? Shouldn't you have checked that first? What's the point of asking now? Lionel replied somewhat coldly. Sale felt a headache coming on. Wasn't this brat playing wronged little brother a bit too well? Damn it. You're the potential heir of a monstrous family. Can't you at least act like it? Sale's expression darkened. But in the end, she pinched her brows and sighed. Forget it. Wasn't this the way of the universe? The powerful did as they pleased and the little people like her had to pick up after them. Who are the freshmen for this round? Me. Radley dashed out of the crowd. Beautiful lady, I was so scared. You're too fast, you left me so far behind. How could you do that? Sale sent Radley's a glance, causing him not to dare cross the half-meter mark between them. But his sly grin never disappeared. Not long later, with a hint of embarrassment, the remaining 3 also made their presences known. All right, follow me. To ensure that nothing else happens, I'll lead you to finish the remaining procedures. Sale turned to leave before sending one last glance back. Luckily, she stopped herself before she looked all the way back and bit her teeth hard. She had to pretend as though she had forgotten about the seniors left in the tree to appease Lionel. Or else who knew if this shameless young master would make a small matter even larger than it was. Unfortunately for her, as bad as her impression of Lionel was, Lionel's impression of her was even worse. These damned organizations, young masters, they're all the same. Lionel and Sale shook their heads. As their backs disappeared into the city, news spread like a wildfire. The humiliation of members of Hero Peak suddenly became a hot topic. Chapter 6:13. Lionel followed behind Sale, casually looking through the city at the feet of the 7 peaks. Though he had previously described this city as small, the truth was that this was only an illusion. It felt quite quaint due to all the nature in the surroundings. But for a city to be at the base of 7 separate peaks, its size didn't need to be explained. This space was taken over by the youths of Valiant Heart. Since a single round of recruitment brought in over 1,000, it wasn't a surprise that they managed to fill in all this space. But Lionel could also tell that there were quite a number here that weren't members of Valiant Heart. Though the city didn't have tourists, what it did have were many traders. It only took a silent walk around the city for Lionel to understand what was happening. Valiant Heart was likely only one protected corner of this fifth-dimensional world. Beyond it, he was sure that there were countless resources. It was at this very city that these resources could be traded. It seemed that Valiant Heart gave quite a bit of freedom to its disciples and students. But Lionel was also sure that they took their fair share of taxes from these transactions. So that's how these factions are competing, huh? Sale and the others had no idea how much Lionel had picked up on a single pass-through of the city. He could clearly see that the shops and various establishments he passed through were separated into 6 avenues. There was no doubt that these 6 represented the 6 peaks. It seemed that there was a lot of tension in the underbelly of this organization. But this also bred a competitive fire that could fuel later generations. The question was, could this fire be turned off in the face of a common enemy? Or would Valiant Heart eat itself alive? This is Valiant Hall. Sale finally led the group to the core of the city. Before them, there was an ancient building that seemed to be the cross of a world center and Roman architecture. Lionel thought it was a shame that they didn't have pyramids considering their style of dress, but he doubted that anyone here would even understand what he was saying if he brought it up. He found it curious though. Though this large building had quirks that existed outside of what one would expect from Roman architecture, it was still eerily similar. Lionel wondered which came first. Was Earth influenced by outside powers? This is where you will register yourselves and become official warriors of Valiant Heart. So that's what they call themselves. Sale led them to be registered one by one. It turned out that the spatial rings they were given not only acted as the life-saving treasure Sale once mentioned, but also acted as their form of identification. Lionel found the number of functions they could pack into such a small device to be quite fascinating. Though he had always said that the more parts a craft had, the more complex it was. There was also another second direction of complexity, and this was incredibly small and miniature crafts that managed to pack a lot of things into a small volume. Lionel wasn't certain which was more complex as a whole. But what he did know was that he had already built a craft with many parts, but he had yet to do the opposite. This left his mind spinning with a lot of untapped potential. Lionel was absent-mindedly registered, barely paying attention as Sale led them around the city once again. This is the location of the Valiant Vault. Usually there are only 3 methods of entry. The first is the golden tags you all should have gotten during the entrance exam. The second is by any number of peak rivalry events that happen over the course of the year. And the third is by breaking peak records. Of these methods, the easiest is definitely the entrance exam, so I hope you all took advantage. I hear that if you accumulate 10 golden tags, you can even trade for a tier 9 weapon. 100 golden tags will get you a quasi-bronze weapon. And though it's nearly impossible, there is a rewards of a tier 1 bronze treasure if you accumulate 1,000 golden tags. Sale thought that her words would excite the group, but when she looked back, she only saw that they were all gazing toward Lionel with weird faces. Though I say this, I advise that you all take advantage of the golden tickets you all have now. Sometimes you have to spend money to make money. You're all currently too weak to even think of earning golden tickets by other means. It's better to improve yourselves now. The more Sale spoke, the more odd she felt that of them were moving. Radley's finally cleared his throat. Beautiful big sister, we don't have any golden tickets. Sale frowned. How's that possible? That old man always gives those who, her words paused, finally following everyone's gaze back to Lionel. Finally realizing that something was off, Lionel looked around. Seeing Valiant Vault proudly displayed in front of him, he just shrugged. Sorry, I gave all my golden tags to someone else. Sale's lip twitched. Without a choice, Sale could only move on, introducing the other locations of Valiant City before dropping them off at their designated residences. Stay put here for as long as you can, she said sternly, and don't cause any trouble. Though she seemed to be speaking to them all, her gaze never left Lionel. Sale grit her teeth and walked away after realizing that Lionel didn't seem to pick up on her hints. She had managed to stop any trouble by being by his side, but she couldn't exactly do this all the time, right? I'll have to assign a mission in Valiant Hall, and have someone keep an eye on the situation, so it doesn't get too out of hand. Sale rushed away as Lionel prepared to walk into his abode. What they were both unaware of was the fact that news had finally drifted to Hephaestus' ears. Chapter 6:14. Hephaestus sat on a meditation pillar that stood 5 meters tall. One leg dangled over the edge while he brought his other knee to his chest. His gaze peered over the ledge, gazing upon the few that had come to report matters to him. This seemingly ordinary pillar was actually one of the resources that youths of Valiant Heart pined over. Yet, Hephaestus was using it as a casual sitting stool, not even practicing force as one would expect. However, at this moment, the few beneath him didn't have the luxury of thinking about how wasteful their vice leader was being. Seeing that crooked smile that hung on Hephaestus' face, with their experience, they could tell that he was just a step away from blowing his lid. We tried our best to cut them down, vice leader. But for some reason, no matter how hard we tried, we couldn't. There's some weird space distortion around the tree. As best as we can tell, if someone more powerful than us doesn't go. The words of the young man were cut off by Hephaestus' laughter. You want someone more powerful to go? Someone recognizable maybe? Somewhat of a genius that everyone has seen before? Hephaestus laughed even more. He felt as though he was getting out of character in just this past day. Oftentimes, humans fell into the trap of doing something they never would. But instead of backtracking after they realized they had made a mistake, they rather chose to double down, causing them to continue down a rabbit hole of doing things they wouldn't ever usually do. Maybe Hephaestus had fallen into this very hole. Spending time on a rookie? What an absolute joke. If it wasn't for the precarious time they were in, he wouldn't have even been sent to personally recruit anyone. Even though Aina had activated the pillars on her first try, Hero Peak wasn't short of individuals who had done exactly that. In fact, while Aina had succeeded in climbing the mountain pass that had been nerfed under the presence of the elders, there were no shortage of people on Hero Peak who had succeeded under the full brunt of the pillar's strength. Yet over this semi-decent talent, he had actually landed himself in such a situation. It was quite pathetic. This matter would be over as easily as him taking action personally, but that would only make a matter he thought was insignificant to begin with even worse. How could he not be furious? It was as though he had tried to squash an ant, only for it to survive and shit into his food later. It was infuriating. What a good little brat. Hephaestus chuckled, the force around him trembling as his muscles ripple like they had a mind of their own. Leave them up there for all I care. They can bleed to death. Hephaestus rose his dangling leg, entering a state and posture of meditation. Hidden patterns on the pillar he sat upon began to glow, causing a typhoon of force to form around him. The youths at the bottom of the pillar looked at one another, not knowing what to do. But in the end, they could only leave. None of them dared to disturb Hephaestus while he was in meditation. I don't need to do anything any longer. Speaking the name of Hero Peak so casually was already enough to seal your fate. As the commotions was only growing as more and more people attempted and failed to take the trio down from the tree, Lionel had entered his home for the next small while. As one might expect, the accommodations for rookies weren't exactly lavish. And since Lionel had given the segmented cube to Aina, he could only make do with what he had. The only things Lionel had taken with him out of the cube were his feather pen and little Tolly. Lionel didn't expect to be barred from seeing Aina. Even if he was, he didn't plan on taking it lying down. He had given her those things as though they might separate only so that she could focus on her training. Lionel knew how important it was to her, so he decided to give her some time to focus on those things. As for him, his goal here wasn't exactly to become stronger. Though that might happen as a byproduct, his main goal was to gather resources. The second reason Lionel had given Aina the segmented cube was because he believed that she would likely have a better training environment than he did. Only in a place like that would the segmented cube be able to grow faster. Resources, resources, resources. Lionel eyed his small bed and narrow window toward the outside. He hadn't gotten to experience college, but he felt like it wouldn't be much different from this at all. Though his accommodations would have probably been better as a five-star quarterback. I guess the first thing I should do is focus on healing myself. Lionel made a decision. He couldn't keep running around like this. It seemed like his worst injury were his cracked ribs, but the truth was that his burnt inner organs had something to say about that. He really hadn't expected that using his Scarlet Star Force would have such a drastic impact on him, but now he had to deal with the consequences. I've already tried to improve Grand Heal, as best I can, but it definitely can't heal me, and is nowhere near good enough to heal Coach. Maybe Lionel took a deep breath. The last time he looked at the core of Merlin's trial world, he almost passed out. But since then he had crossed into the peak of the fourth dimension with his soul force. Maybe he stood more of a chance now. His only path forward seemed to be that complex world of force arts. Lionel began to cast numerous spells to lock down the defenses of his small room and shelter him from distractions from the outside. He had no idea the kind of surprise he was in for. And even worse than that, he had no idea the kind of commotion his sudden disappearance would cause either. Chapter 6:15. Lionel brought out a particular snow globe from his spatial ring, staring at its surface for a long while. He could immediately tell that something had changed about it, but he couldn't quite put his finger on exactly what it was. This particular snow globe had spent no small amount of time in the lab setting, sitting on a shelf. And what Lionel didn't know was that it had undergone this change long ago, more than half a year ago, in fact. However, in his caution, Lionel had kept at arm's length from anything related to it, choosing instead to focus on other things. In the past, Lionel might have recklessly chosen to charge forth. But learning a bit of caution, he brought out the only tool he could continuously rely on. A part of his mind felt that he relied on the dictionary a bit too much. At least for now, though, he didn't feel that this was worth harping on. Is it safe for me to observe this force art? After a while of being unsure of how to approach this matter despite the fact his instincts were screaming at him every which way, Lionel decided on the most logical question. Ping. Replying to Seed, it is not completely safe. Lionel sighed. Once again with these overly straightforward answers. The more Lionel learned about crafting, though, the more he realized just what sort of feat it was for his father to create such a thing. If the dictionary had to be classified, Lionel was absolutely certain that it was beyond the silver grade. Lionel expecting more complex answers was akin to wishing this dictionary would birth intelligence of its own. But at that point, the dictionary wouldn't just be a treasure, it would likely be capable of being classified as its own form of life. Such a thing would be far beyond Lionel's scope of understanding, and would likely be even beyond a gold-grade treasure. After thinking for a moment, Lionel settled on another question. What exactly is unsafe? Ping. The observation of force law arts requires a strong foundation of mental fortitude and computational ability. It is inadvisable to observe this force law art unless you have begun to reinforce your mind. Force law art? Lionel was intrigued. This was the first time he had heard this term. It had some familiar parts, but wasn't entirely so. Realizing this, Lionel pressed for more answers. Ping. A force law art is a category of force art that has no functional ability, but rather lays the law for the function of derivative force arts. The definition was simple, but Lionel felt as though an explosion had gone off in his mind. If he understood this to mean what he thought this meant, it was a massive boon. Steadying his breathing, Lionel calmed himself. He had already understood that this must be the true reward from the Camelot Zone. However, what he still didn't understand was exactly what change it had undergone for him to feel as though it was so much different now than it had been in the past. What caused the change in this force law art? Ping. The force law art was incomplete until the mythological zone it was constructed from was perfectly cleared. It was then that Lionel finally understood. He had thought that the only reward for completing the Camelot Zone and solving the love triangle was the evolution of Earth. But it turned out that he couldn't have been more wrong. What function did a force law art provide? When Lionel embarked on the journey of improving Camelot's spells, He tried his best to deconstruct their force arts into their most simple form. By breaking them down and rebuilding them, he was able to somewhat better understand how spells were formed. As a result of this, he became capable of layering and combining spells of even two separate attributes together, as he displayed during his battle with the puppet master. However, ultimately, the improvement Lionel was able to bring about wasn't very great. Though he allowed a peak third-dimensional spell to display power rivaling that of a fourth-dimensional one, it wasn't enough of a change to be worth it. When Lionel battled the seniors just now, he didn't even consider using spells because the trade-off just wasn't worth it, despite the fact his mind was the most powerful part of himself at the moment. What this force law art provided was a path forward. Rather than stumbling forward himself, it was like Lionel had been handed a decryption key. Now the enigma that had been the laws that governed Camelot's spells opened up to him, and read no differently from any other book. And the best part of all of this was the fact that the root of the law itself wasn't restricted by dimensions. There was no doubt that there were some mythological zones that were more valuable than others. Even if one cleared two and gained full rewards from both, there was no guarantee that the new magic system one gained from it would have the same potential. This was all to say that no two magic systems were built to reach the true heights of the universe, and the odds of stumbling into a new magic system that could rival the oldest of the existing ones was slim too. Still, even with all that being said, if there was going to be one world capable of producing such a magic system from the very first mythological zone it produced, it would most definitely be Earth. As for whether Camelot's magic system truly had such potential, only time would tell. However, Lionel didn't mind even if it became useless after the fourth dimension. All he wanted was for it to be of use now. As for the future, he could deal with it then. With these thoughts completed, Lionel sat on his small bed and sank his mind into the snow globe, still unaware that trouble had already come knocking. Chapter 6:16. Lionel immediately felt overwhelmed. In order to hide the existence of the force law art, a treasure Lionel was sure that even worlds would war over, he had chosen to keep it within the snow globe. But he hadn't taken time to consider the disconnect his mind and body would feel in doing so. Lionel felt as though his concept of time had been completely destroyed. As much as he would love to believe that this meant that he had unlocked some new cheat, he knew better than to think this. Maybe it was a product of his high dream force affinity, but he was quite good at seeing through illusions of the mind. As a result, he could tell that while his mind felt as though time had come to a grinding halt, his body was still very much experiencing it in real time. This seemingly small matter resulted in Lionel wasting over an hour before he even thought of gazing at the force law art. Lionel immediately retracted his mind from the snow globe, a cold sweat on his forehead. He realized then that had it not been for his high dream force affinity, he may very well have been stuck in the snow globe to the end of his life. Of course, things wouldn't be so exaggerated. As long as just one person came to check on him, he would be able to leave. Well, as long as that person was determined enough to smash through the protections he had put up. But it was a scary thought, the list. Wow. So this is Time Force. This was the first time Lionel had come across Time Force, and it was only now he truly understood how fearsome it was. Much like everything else in his segmented cube, he took the snow globes for granted. But the reality was that their value was impossibly great as well. If someone with Time Force affinity knew that Lionel had such things and in such large quantities, they'd likely be willing to give up whatever large amount of wealth they had for just one. Well, that or they'd go all out to kill him. Being able to have the opportunity to observe Time Force at work was rare. Yet it seemed like Lionel could do so whenever he wanted. Lionel took a deep breath. This time, he steeled his mind and was prepared for the sudden change. The world within the snow globe was an expanse of white fog. At least, that was what it was normally when there was nothing to be stored within it. But now, there was a massive globe of floating golden symbols. It felt as though Lionel had stepped into the inner workings of a clock. Every shift in a rune or symbol here would cause a chain reaction that ricocheted throughout the whole force law art. Just standing there, Lionel found himself awed at its beauty. At that moment, Lionel felt a tiny prick on his finger. 20 minutes already? This time, Lionel had commanded little Tolly to give him a small prick in 20-minute intervals. He could hardly believe that even though he felt like he was on guard this time, that he still managed to wash away so much time so easily. Still, there was a difference now. Lionel hadn't gotten lost due to some feeling of time dilation, but rather due to the beauty of the force law art. Maybe only he would be able to say that such a complex system was beautiful, but this was truly how Lionel saw it. If he could one day create a craft so perfect, just what level would it be at? So that's why Camelot uses spiritual wood as a medium. Ugh, spiritual wood is such a terrible name. Let's call it magewood. Wait, no, that's even worse. Let's throw out the wood part entirely, it ruins everything. Lionel settled on the name spiritual medium, because even after just 20 minutes of study, Lionel realized that this so-called spiritual medium didn't have to be wood at all. The basic principle of Camelot's spells was amplification. When Lionel was first learning light elemental mage arts, he was stunned by how simple they were. But what he soon found out afterward was that the simple layered on itself to form more and more complex spell structures. The amplification of this layering was where the strength of powerful spells came from. A spiritual medium took advantage of this foundational law of Camelot's mage arts. During the conjuring of a spell, it amplified each one of the individual basic parts, thus making the whole more powerful. Lionel realized right then that if he really wanted to heal his coach, maybe reforming a new healing spell wasn't necessary. If he could just find an excellent spiritual medium, his strength could increase by 10 times without even learning a single new spell. As for what could be used as a spiritual medium, Lionel realized that anything with high soul force compatibility could work. The reason the trees Camelot formed their wands out of worked so well was because they were a special breed capable of purifying regular force. This made them good outlets for soul force, which was essentially just that. I don't have any spiritual mediums powerful enough, and I also don't want to carry around a wand. Maybe it was the teenage angst in him, but Lionel had no intention of running around like Gandalf. From what Lionel could tell, the wand format was just a product of circumstance. Wood wasn't exactly the easiest material to work with, and restricting the spiritual tree too much would cause it to lose its functions. But if Lionel picked a better spiritual medium, then he could mold it into anything he liked. Lionel nodded to himself. But for now, he didn't act on this thought. The spiritual medium he needed would have to be high grade within the 4th dimension. Getting such a resource from this place would require strength. And that once again brought him back to a need to heal himself. Lionel turned his attention back to the massive inner workings of the force law art again. Just 20 minutes got him such a breakthrough. Though it seemed meaningless and quite tiny, one needed to consider how long it must have taken Camelot to realize the benefits of a spiritual medium. There were many discoveries throughout history that seemed trivial, until they suddenly weren't. Outside of Lionel's dorm room-like accommodations, the commotion was only growing. A youth stood amidst many. His face was flushed red from exertion, and his mouth opened so wide one could fit 2 fists into it. He looked somewhat comical, but the booming voice that came out as a result had already been shaking the freshman houses for several hours already. Coward of the freshman class, come seek your punishment. All around this roaring youth, there was a group of what seemed to be 6. But considering the emblem on their neckwear, everyone knew that they were from Hero Peak. It seems that coward isn't enough of an insult for him. Start with Plan B. One of the youths said plainly. Chapter 6:17. The young man with the large mouth hesitated when he heard these words. Saying such things, usually, when two behemoths faced off against each other, it was always the little people who suffered most. He was just a freshman, no different from Lionel. Yet because he quite literally had a big mouth, he ended up in this situation. In truth, he was among the group who had surrounded Lionel and Aina during that time. But for obvious reasons, he hadn't been able to lay a hand on either. As a result, he ended up venting his frustrations in one of the few open bars freshmen could afford, and happened to be overheard. Once again, because of his big mouth. Now he had been standing here, yelling insults for the past several hours. By now, his throat was scorched and his tongue felt heavy. He really needed water, but he was also too afraid to ask these seniors for such aid. He couldn't even muster up the courage to look at them. From time to time, he would send pleading glances toward his fellow freshmen, but they only returned rage-fueled gazes back. These were the freshman living quarters after all. In an ironic twist, Lionel, the one person they wanted to bother the most, was likely the only one unbothered by this turn of events. Obviously, as mere freshmen, they couldn't even dream of turning their anger toward the seniors. If even the likes of Inkith had to tread carefully around these youths, who were they to do any different as youths who couldn't even match up to him? As a result, everyone turned their anger toward their fellow freshmen. Why the hell did he have to have such a big mouth? The young man was known as Tetris. But at this moment, the only thing he could be happy about was that very few knew this. He wanted to cry real tears, but could only suck it up. I'll just have to wear a mask and change my voice until all of this blows over. Taking a deep breath and holding back a stream of salty liquid, Tetris began to bellow once more. I hear your name is Lionel. It's too bad that you were too much of a coward to tell us yourself, so we had to call up your mother. Don't worry, we gave her a good time. How else do you think we got her to sell out her own son? A silence fell over the freshman quarters. Beads of sweat fell down Tetris' brow. He really thought that there was no way any man would allow such words to be said about his mother. If Lionel was ignoring him before, there was simply no fathomable way that he would continue to do so. The eerie silence that fell over the freshman quarters felt like a calm before the storm. But even after more than 2 minutes, there was still no movement from the freshman quarters. The youth beside gave Tetris another signal. Since the first wasn't enough, they would just go down the rabbit hole. He really wanted to see if this Lionel would truly not dare to step out after they were through raking his name through the mud. Author's note: fair warning. I got a bit creative with these ones. I think I need to see a therapist. A man who doesn't step out to protect his own mother's name? I get it. When you were being conceived, your old man had his cock in his hand, bending over the side of the bed with sweat pouring down his face, taking bets for which of your whore mother's gangbangers would father you. I also hear that your mother birthed you along with a steaming pile of shit. She was so cum drunk, she couldn't tell which pile of garbage was you. Who the hell knows what she was doing up until she went into labor? Don't worry about your little girlfriend. We have real men over at Hero Peak. She's getting your mother's treatment, and then some. When next you see her, she won't even be able to remember your name. Her vocabulary will be whittled down to yes, daddy. And right away, daddy. Tetris' barrage of insults only seemed to grow worse and worse. No stone was left unturned. It was like a rapid-fire collection of what would only expect to find in the worst kind of dojin. It was a horror to listen to without a doubt. The youths who had come to the freshman quarters knew their limits. They didn't dare to cause a commotion throughout the whole city, or else they would be annoying people they couldn't afford to annoy. So Tetris' voice was restricted to the few kilometer-long strip assigned to freshmen, but that didn't stop news from spreading like wildfire, especially after there was not a single movement from Lionel, even after all this time. On a building a distance away, a youth wearing the emblem of Valiant Hall sat, looking on with a half-bored, half-amused expression. He had come here to protect Lionel at Sale's will, but he didn't expect this brat to actually be such a coward. Of all the Hero Peak members you had to catch the attention of, it had to be that sadistic bastard. The young man, who went by Jerson, looked at the back profile of the youth standing by Tetris, handing him orders every so often. Even just his back view made him seem like a writhing snake, ready to pounce. He had only been in Valiant Heart for 3 years, yet he had already been promoted to a white belt, and was only a step away from entering the ranks of blue belts. Unfortunately, his strength was just one aspect. What he was truly known for was being the king of the oars. He was a business-savvy individual, who practically hoarded merits thanks to his borderline evil business practices. Him targeting Lionel like this was truly a case of bad luck. It seemed that this king of oars, Serioth, was using Lionel as a stepping stone to ease his promotion to blue belt. Teeth. Bad luck indeed. But what does this have to do with me? Jerson leaned back on the rooftop, half closing his eyes. Chapter 6:18. Lionel had no idea what was happening on the outside. How could he? Even if someone was knocking on his door at this very moment, he wouldn't hear it. The more he studied the force law art, the greater his comprehension became. Every so often he would test this by, somewhat ironically, buffing the protections on his little room. This only made it even more unlikely for him to hear what was going on. Even if the whole of the freshman quarters fell to an earthquake, it was very likely that Lionel would be left unharmed. He might not even be able to tell that such a thing was happening to begin with. Lionel completely immersed himself in the world of Camelot's magic system. He made one discovery after another. He almost felt like a kid who had gone back to grade school. The rapid changes in his thought process almost left him in awe. He realized then that he was actually forming a way of thought. All throughout one's formative years, maybe what was most important wasn't what you learned, but how you learned it. What was more important than how much you knew was the way you had come to understand it all. Unfortunately, too often, methods of thought were extremely high-level classes left to youths who had already had their minds molded. By then, it was often too late to change much of anything. But at this moment, Lionel felt that he was in a unique position. Not only was he aware of the importance of this method of thought, but he was also simultaneously in the position of a youth learning everything for the first time. He immediately realized that this was yet another opportunity. And maybe just as quickly, he realized what the cornerstone for his method of thought should be. There were two factors, flexibility and foundation. As described before, Camelot's magic system was bottom-up. Rather than constructing new spells for every use case, what it instead did was build upon existing spells to create new, more powerful and more useful ones. One might wonder how this might be different from other magic systems. Well, one could take, for example, Lionel's Morales family's metal synergy lineage factor. This alone could be constituted as its own magic system. This one reliant on the absorption of metals. One could build an entire civilization on this concept alone. These two magic systems were similar in that they both relied on setting strong foundations. Lionel could build new affinities for himself, but he had to start from the bottom and work his way up. In this way, the two were very similar. However, where they differed was in their flexibility. The foundational pieces of Camelot's magic system could be easily swapped and weren't as rigid as the Morales family's. If Lionel started building a space affinity for himself, he couldn't just discard it for the sake of a time affinity. In Camelot's system, though, if Lionel began to build his way toward an extremely powerful fire mage art, swapping out its foundational pieces would be as easy as thinking it. One might think that this wasn't a fair comparison. After all, one was a mage art that could be deployed and retrieved at will, while the latter was a body cultivation art that was in perpetual action. But Lionel felt that this was an improper way to think about it, especially the more he studied Camelot's magic system. Lionel believed that the best way to maximize this magic system was to focus on the element you had affinity with and slowly build a massive spell structure over time. This spell structure would combine all the lowest level spells you had the highest compatibility with to form the strongest mage art you could cast. If one looked at it this way, with the spell being a lifelong partner that could be refined over several decades, to centuries, to even millennia, then was it really so different? Lionel believed that if given enough time, Camelot would have eventually stumbled onto this truth as well. They already had the foundation, and this was obviously the most logical next step. Yes, this is the right path, the most optimal path for this magic system. Oh, call it Mage Core. Mage Core. As a young mage, one would begin to form this mage core within one's ethereal glabella. Not much unlike the spear embryo within Lionel's, one would nurture and help foster the growth of this mage core. One would begin with the lowest level basic spells and build upward, eventually constructing an ultimate spell unique to yourself. This was the basic idea Lionel settled upon after the second hour concluded. But by the time he got to the fourth, it evolved once again. By the time a half day had passed, the concept of this mage core had been morphed once more. All the while, force elements were slowly congealing within Lionel's ethereal glabella. At first, it was a sphere. but it began to slowly change, growing a stem, and eventually beautiful twinkling leaves. As the hours and eventually days ticked by, a gorgeous multicolored flower had bloomed within Lionel's mind. Its stem was a swirl of colors that eventually opened to a budding rose. It had one petal that flickered with a deep crimson, licks of fire dancing across its surface. It had another petal that seemed white on first inspection, but had a delicate blue hue to it. It twinkled like the finest stars in the sky. Yet another petal was a radiant gold. Yet, unlike the heavy metal, it waved in the wind, looking more flexible than the lightest feather. The final petal was a deep black. Its every movement caused the space around it to crack and fold. How it managed to stay in place without shattering the delicate flower to pieces was a wonder of nature. Lionel felt that calling this a mage core was no longer appropriate. However, he chose to stick with it, not knowing how this budding flower might choose to change in the future. On that day, almost half a month after he first entered meditation, Lionel expelled a long breath and opened his eyes. At that moment, a swirl of force shot toward him, inadvertently shattering his protections. A massive cyclone formed overhead, throwing the freshman quarters into another upheaval. Lionel's mage core rose within his ethereal glabella, finding a home amidst his 3 rotating stars. Chapter 619. The sudden change took hold of the whole of Valiant City. Whereas the commotion had once only taken hold of the freshman quarters, at this point, it was as though the force of Valiant Heart had all chosen to concentrate toward one region. There wasn't a single person that didn't sense the change. From the weakest to the strongest, they all looked toward one particular direction. Lionel looked down at his own body, feeling strength flooding through it. This is it. Lionel lip curled. One had to remember that the core of Merlin's trial world encompassed the whole magic system of Camelot. Back then, was it only mages that had entered? The answer was obviously no. So, in that case, why was it that it seemed that Lionel was so focused on the path of a mage, but didn't say anything about knights from start to end? The truth was that there was a thin line of separation between the two. The path that Camelot had split into 2 had always meant to be one. The 4 petals on Lionel's mage core bloomed, growing a fold in size. At that moment, a 5th petal began to form, growing until it balanced the rest into a state of absolute perfection. Even the crackling of the black petal seemed to ease, calming until it only sent small ripples in every direction. This 5th petal was other than Lionel's Earth variant affinity. It held a beautiful bronze color, its every movement causing what sounded like sharpening metal to ring through the air. This was the process of Lionel's body perfectly combining with his magic. He could feel it coursing through his pores, filling his body up with a brimming strength. As the light element flooded through him, his body began to rapidly heal. As the fire and star elements surged through his veins, he felt as though his resistance against his own scarlet star force had skyrocketed. As the earth element rippled through his body, the foundation of his metal body grew steadier, opening up a path toward forward progress. And finally, as the space element shook his body to its very core, he felt as though his divine armor had fused with him toward a new level of perfection. This is Camelot's true magic system, a system where the best spiritual medium is other than one's own body. Lionel felt like he could call down the elements with a thought, fueling his actions with the force of the world. It was difficult for Lionel to concentrate his half-month of study into just a few words, but if he had to, it almost felt like he had turned his body into a lightning rod for magic. Whereas in the past he needed to use his soul force to draw force arts to call down the elements, he didn't need force arts to do so anymore. It was almost as though Lionel had gained an ability. However, what was scariest about this ability was that when Lionel consciously chose to draw force arts, not only would it be even faster than his already blazing speed, it would be tens of times more powerful. This was the true beginning of Camelot's magic system. Grand Heel. A pillar of golden light fell from the skies. It tore a path through the dorm rooms, leaving everything practically unscathed. The only change was that everyone who passed by this light suddenly felt lighter on their feet, Like all their hidden injuries and worries had been washed away. Lionel took a deep breath, soaking up all the golden lights as though a drunkard. With just a single grand heal, he had gone from 70% healed to over 80%. He cast it a few more times, feeling intoxicated. After the sixth, he finally managed to return to 100%. He felt his bones pop and crackle. He stood, the floors beneath his feet threatening to shatter. Having stepped into the true gate of this magic system, Lionel didn't even have to modify the spells he already knew to display combat prowess equivalent to the fourth dimension. This was how great a boost forming his mage core had given him. Even the simplest of spells had become exponentially more powerful. It's not quite enough to heal, coach, but I only need to focus on rebuilding the spell from the ground up to get the results I want. If I was a doctor, restructuring healing spells would be much easier, but unfortunately, as Lionel was lost in his thoughts, the commotion of force he had caused slowed until it was as though nothing had even happened. It was at that exact moment that a voice familiar to all the freshmen sounded once again. "Lionel, you scolding piece of trash." Huh? Lionel's gaze seemed to penetrate through the walls. He didn't like having his thoughts interrupted, and he would have already put up another silencing array had it not been for the fact he just heard his own name. "I heard your mother picked your last name out of a hat. Too bad she couldn't remember who her bastard kid's daddy was." Lionel's gaze went cold. Outside, Thetra's voice continued to boom. He had been shocked by the sudden shift in force, but he regained his confidence after it dimmed down. Over the past 2 weeks, he had gotten more bold. Since Lionel was too scared to come out, what did he have to fear exactly? The best part was that he was also getting paid handsomely, and he didn't even have to yell continuously like he had in the past. Now he only had to say something every few hours, and he even got ample time for rest and play. His only task was to remind everyone that Lionel was a coward who didn't dare to do anything in the face of such insults. He was quite happy with this arrangement even though he wasn't necessarily needed. By now, Lionel's face was plastered all over Valiant City in the form of a bounty parody. Even without him, people wouldn't forget. He took a swing of water, a wide grin on his face. "Did you know, Lionel? Everyone knows you as Leo the Cuck now. The bounty posters are everywhere. It's a shame you can't see them. It's alright though, every night when we fuck your girlfriend to sleep, she cuddles up with one in her arms." Thetris took another swing of his water, ready to shout out at the top of his lungs again. But his words were suddenly caught in his throat. He didn't know when, but a tall shadow had suddenly appeared before him. On the roof of a building not far away, Jerson's eyes shot open. Chapter 620. Lionel looked down toward Thetris, whose mouth hung half open. The latter was so stunned by the sudden change that the swig of water he had just taken drizzled out from his mouth, falling down his chin and drenching his shirt completely. Lionel's hand was like a snaking whip, shooting forward so quickly that Thetris didn't even have a chance to register its movement, let alone react to it. Thetris keeled over, feeling as though every bone in his rib cage had shattered simultaneously. His body seemed to lag behind the shot of pain he felt. Time dilated, his body convulsing in a fit of pain before, only then shooting backward like a rocket. He crashed into a thick pillar, his spine warping. The freshman quarters fell into another bout of silence. Truthfully, over the past 2 weeks, they had learned to live with Thetris' voice. They had no choice in the matter. It was either they accept it, or leave Valiant Heart entirely. None of them dared to deal with a person protected by a white belt. So how would they dare touch Thetris? The pillar Thetris had just crashed into was just one of many surrounding a community meditation square. It was meant to be one of the many tasked with helping concentrate force in this region. Though it was much worse than the personal meditation rooms, as freshmen who couldn't afford anything, this was the best they could do with. Knowing this, there was no surprise then that there weren't a small number of people present. Many of them had learned to ignore Thetris, so they hadn't seen the initial collision. But they had most definitely heard the end result. When they looked toward the direction Thetris had come flying from, they all felt their heart skip a beat. Lionel was completely expressionless, but the energies around him seemed to be seething in rage for him. The wind around him was still, almost too still. But it was as though the world refused to regain its normal color. Lionel's figure blurred, appearing before Tetris in another blink. Hey, hey, hey. Lionel found his wrist clamped down by someone else just as he was about to grab Tetris' head. What are you trying to do here exactly? Kill him? Jerson frowned, looking at Lionel as though he had lost his mind. If you were going to vent, don't you think it's a bit pathetic to wait until the true culprits have all disappeared just to take out your rage on a pawn? Are you even a man? Jerson's disdain for Lionel boiled over. He couldn't help but feel disgust when he looked at this young man. He didn't know why Sale had asked him to protect him, but if he had to guess, it was because Lionel's family background wasn't simple. But for Lionel to have a family background robust enough for Sale to tiptoe around him, yet end up in Valiant Heart, well, wasn't the conclusion obvious? He was too pathetic to make it in his big shot family, so he came here to flex his talent, only to realize that Valiant Heart had its fair share of steel plates to accidentally kick. The result was him hiding away in his little dorm room for weeks, only to come and bully someone far weaker than him. If that wasn't pathetic, then what was? It was clear that many agreed with Jerson's words. The freshmen remained silent in their places of meditation, but most of them agreed. Their looks of disdain alone seemed to make the atmosphere several times heavier. But what no one expected was for Jerson to have hardly finished his words before he suddenly found a knee approaching his chin. Ha! Jerson couldn't even react before he felt his jaw rattle. It was as though a steel club had swept up and through him. If it wasn't for the fact he had just shut his mouth, he would have bitten his tongue clean off. Lionel ripped his wrist out of Jerson's grasp. His fist cocked back even as Jerson's feet lifted off the ground. Flames suddenly erupted on his knuckles, concentrating to the point they formed a level of crimson that seemed reserved for hell. Bang! Lionel's fist collided against Jerson's chest. The latter flew backward, a trail of smoke and crackling flames following his trajectory. It felt like he had been before Lionel in one instant, but in the next, he had collided with another pillar, blood flying from his lips. Jerson sank down, violently coughing. Unlike Tetris, though, he didn't lose consciousness immediately. He landed on the ground, his face grimacing in pain, but the flicker of rage behind his gaze was palpable. Huh? Attacking a member of Valiant Hall? It seems you really have a death wish. Jerson growled, pushing his body up. At that moment, his blue eyes flickered with arcs of lightning. He stood, his body exploding forward with an impossible speed. But he lost track of Lionel almost instantly. When next he saw him, he found a palm closing in on his face. Lionel appeared to Jerson's side, his palm shattering the latter's nose. In that very instant, his fingers clamped down on Jerson's skull. His back flexed, his thigh bulging. Bang! The back of Jerson's head smashed into the ground. The stone tiles of the community meditation square shattered, shooting up into the skies in a rain of rubble. Jerson's eyes rolled back, their whites looking up into the sky. Lionel stood, his pace even as he walked back to Tetris. It was as though he had never fought Jerson to begin with, as though he never truly took the latter seriously. Just like that, in the blink of an eye, a promising youth of Valiant Hall, a genius who had already gotten promoted to a white belt, was defeated. Lionel kneeled by Tetris' side, picking up the latter by his hair to force their eyes level. Tetris teetered and winced, his consciousness fading in and out. He wanted nothing more than to collapse and forget the pain his body was in, but the more Lionel moved him around, the less of a chance he had at this dream of his. Start speaking, or else I'm going to pin your headless corpse to this pillar. Chapter 621. Reminder that since it's the weekend, there will only be 2 chapters today and tomorrow. Back to 4 on Monday. The streets around Lionel seemed to grow especially silent. The sight of a single young man dragging 2 half-dead youths behind him was quite one to behold indeed, especially when one of them wore the emblem of Valiant Hall. Even Hero Peak didn't dare to mistreat the members of that hall so blatantly, even though they had launched plenty of underhanded schemes of their own. It didn't take long for Minnie to match Lionel's face to the bounty posters that had been plastered all around Valiant City. Though the most promising youths of Valiant Heart usually spent most of their time in their peaks, making use of training rooms, the city was almost always filled by the lesser-than characters of the organization. Beyond this, there were also some high-class establishments that the true talents used to blow off some steam. However, Lionel's goal wasn't one of these high-class establishments, but rather a low-class one almost anyone could afford. And unfortunately for Jerson, who wouldn't be caught dead in such a place, his actions had made Lionel think that he was part of all of this, resulting in him being dragged through the city to this very establishment. Lionel's foot blasted through the doors of the low-class bar. One would think that he had to rely on his strength to do so, but he was certain that even if he was still a normal human, he would have been able to accomplish the same feat just as easily. The doors of the bar hung loosely from their hinges, barely holding on even before Lionel's actions. Now, however, they found themselves flying out, finally free from their rotting wooden frames. If the inside of the bar had to be described in just a single word, it would be stale. It had dingy yellow lights, a musty smell, and brimmed with testosterone. It was almost as though a woman had never set foot into this place. And if they had, it definitely hadn't been with pure intentions. This was apparently the bar that Tetris had been overheard in, and was also the place the so-called King of Ors had recruited him from. Hey, what do you think you're doing? The immediate response to Lionel's actions was hostility. Most of the businesses run in Valiant City were owned by youths. As one might expect, the competition over land and their rights was quite stiff. Even for a dilapidated place like this, there was no doubt that there was a genius behind it somewhere. Attacking a place like this was no different from slapping the face of a senior. So it was no wonder the reaction, despite the perpetual rowdiness of the place, was still so exaggerated. The bartender immediately jumped to action. Even in the dim lights, the white belt wrapped around his waist was clear for all to see. It didn't take Lionel more than a single glance to tell that he was Tier 5 in strength. Not only was he Tier 5, but compared to the Tier 4s Lionel had originally defeated when he first stepped foot in this city, he was exponentially more powerful. However, even as he jumped over the counter, planting a single palm down as an anchor, Lionel only spoke a single sentence that stopped him in his tracks. "You're free to keep attacking, but in return I'll burn this whole place to the ground." Flickering flames danced across Lionel's skin. He looked no different from a flaming human, prepared to blast the small bar to smithereens. The bartender paused, his brow furrowing into a frown. He scanned Lionel up and down, eventually landing on the two he dragged by their hair. His pupils constricted when he recognized Jerson. White belt might have been the line of demarcation between freshmen and seniors, but there were obviously lines of division between them. Usually, this was decided by time taken. The bartender had taken 3 years to promote to white belt. But all geniuses like Jerson took less than a single year. The fact that Jerson was in such a state made the bartender realize that he should be thanking Lionel, or else he would have ended up in the same state. He gulped, his body tensing. Even though the owner of this bar wouldn't have to fear Lionel, by the time he got here for revenge, wouldn't he have already suffered the worst? Considering how little that senior cared about this place, why would he care about a small-time bartender? "Why have you come?" The bartender spoke, trying to maintain his calm. 2 weeks ago, Lionel said plainly. There was a senior who came here to recruit him. Lionel threw Tetris forward without a care for his injuries. Who is that senior and where is he? Lionel seemed to be asking a question, but his demeanor was so bitingly cold, and his words so demanding that it almost felt like a statement. The bartender didn't even feel like not answering was an option. Sending a scared glance toward Tetris, a stream of memories immediately flooded the bartender's mind. But when he realized the kind of information Lionel wanted, he froze. A cold sweat began to pour down his forehead, his fingers beginning to tremble. On one side, there was the youth right in front of him, clearly uncaring about humiliating the senior who owned this bar. He was a madman and clearly nothing like the coward the Leo the Cuck posters painted him out to be. But on the other side, there was the King of Ors, a vicious man known as a snake by many. The kind of poisonous existence who had done any and everything to claim the wealth he had now. Not answering the question would cause this demon incarnate to come down on him. But while answering it would save his life for now, what would happen when the matters of today returned to the ears of the King of Ors? It's just a simple math equation, don't you think? Like the voice of a reaper. Lionel's voice drifted into the bartender's ears. If you do answer, you'll anger just one man. But if you don't, I'll burn down this bar and beat you half dead. That way, you'll enrage both me and your boss, while eventually telling me what I want to know anyway. So what do you choose? You're tuning in to the Lee May's Sword of Destiny YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.